He hunted bears, braved battles, and told his own story long before others turned him into legend. And in 1836, Davy Crockett died where myths are born, at the Alamo. From the wild hills of Tennessee to the halls of Congress, Crockett lived by grit, wit, and raw frontier spirit. He married, fought, hunted, and stood up to power, even when it cost him politically. But his greatest tales came not from others, but from his own hand, when he wrote the story of his life and sealed his place in American myth. This is the journey of the man behind the legend, before the final stand, before the last charge, before the Alamo. How did a bear-hunting pioneer rise from the backwoods to national fame? And what drove him to fight and die for a cause not fully his own? The campfire is ready, so stay with me tonight. The story is about to start. My name is Sam, and this is Wild America. Chapter 1. As the public seem to feel some interest in the history of an individual so humble as I am, and as that history can be so well known to no person living as to myself, I have, after so long a time, and under many pressing solicitations from my friends and acquaintances, at last determined to put my own hand to it, and lay before the world a narrative on which they may at least rely as being true. And seeking no ornament or coloring for a plain, simple tale of truth, I throw aside all hypocritical and fawning apologies, and, according to my own maxim, just go ahead. Where I am not known, I might perhaps gain some little credit by having thrown around this volume some of the flowers of learning. But where I am known, the vile cheatery would soon be detected, and like the foolish jackdaw that with a borrowed tail attempted to play the peacock, I should be justly robbed of my pilfered ornaments, and sent forth to strut without a tail for the balance of my time. I shall commence my book with what little I have learned of the history of my father, as all great men rest many, if not most, of their hopes on their noble ancestry. Mine was poor, but I hope honestly, and even that is as much as many a man can say. But to my subject, my father's name was John Crockett, and he was of Irish descent. He was either born in Ireland or on a passage from that country to America across the Atlantic. He was by profession a farmer, and spent the early part of his life in the state of Pennsylvania. The name of my mother was Rebecca Hawkins. She was an American woman, born in the state of Maryland, between York and Baltimore. It is likely I may have heard where they were married, but if so, I have forgotten. It is, however, certain that they were, or else the public would never have been troubled with the history of David Crockett, their son. I have an imperfect recollection of the part which I have understood my father took in the Revolutionary War. I personally know nothing about it, for it happened to be a little before my day. But from himself and many others who were well acquainted with its troubles and afflictions, I have learned that he was a soldier in the Revolutionary War, and took part in that bloody struggle. He fought, according to my information, in the battle at King's Mountain against the British and Tories, and in some other engagements of which my remembrance is too imperfect to enable me to speak with any certainty. At some time, though I cannot say certainly when, my father, as I have understood, lived in Lincoln County in the state of North Carolina. How long, I don't know. But when he removed from there, he settled in that district of the country which is now embraced in the East Division of Tennessee, though it was not then erected into a state. He settled there under dangerous circumstances, both to himself and his family, as the country was full of Indians, who were at that time very troublesome. By the creeks, my grandfather and grandmother Crockett were both murdered, in their own house, and on the very spot of ground where Rogersville in Hawkins County now stands. At the same time the Indians wounded Joseph Crockett, a brother to my father, by a ball, which broke his arm, and took James a prisoner, who was still a younger brother than Joseph, and who, from natural defects, was less able to make his escape, as he was both deaf and dumb. He remained with them for 17 years and 9 months, when he was discovered and recollected by my father and his eldest brother, William Crockett, and was purchased by them from an Indian trader at a price which I do not now remember. But so it was that he was delivered up to them, and they returned him to his relatives. He now lives in Cumberland County in the state of Kentucky, though I have not seen him for many years. My father and mother had 6 sons and 3 daughters. I was the 5th son. What a pity I hadn't been the 7th. For then I might have been, by common consent, called doctor, as a heap of people get to be great men. But like many of them, I stood no chance to become great in any other way than by accident. As my father was very poor and living as he did far back in the backwoods, he had neither the means nor the opportunity to give me, or any of the rest of his children, any learning. But before I get on the subject of my own troubles and a great many very funny things that have happened to me, like all other historians and biographers, I should not only inform the public that I was born, myself as well as other folks, but that this important event took place, according to the best information I have received on the subject, on the 17th of August, in the year 1786. Whether by day or night I believe I never heard, but if I did, I have forgotten. I suppose, however, it is not very material to my present purpose, nor to the world, as the more important fact is well attested that I was born. And indeed it might be inferred, from my present size and appearance, that I was pretty well born, though I have never yet attached myself to that numerous and worthy society. At that time my father lived at the mouth of Limestone on the Nolichucky River, and for the purpose not only of showing what sort of a man I now am, but also to show how soon I began to be a sort of a little man, I have endeavored to take the back track of life in order to fix on the first thing that I can remember. But even then, as now, so many things were happening that, as Major Jack Downing would say, they are all in a pretty considerable of a snarl. And I find it kinder hard to fix on that thing, among them all, which really happened first. But I think it likely I have hit on the outside line of my recollection, as one thing happened at which I was so badly scared that it seems to me I could not have forgotten it if it had happened a little time only after I was born. Therefore, it furnishes me with no certain evidence of my age at the time, but I know one thing very well, and that is, that when it happened, I had no knowledge of the use of breeches, for I had never had any, nor worn any. But the circumstance was this. My 4 elder brothers, and a well-grown boy of about 15 years old, by the name of Campbell, and myself, were all playing on the river's side, when all the rest of them got into my father's canoe and put out to amuse themselves on the water, leaving me on the shore alone. Just a little distance below them there was a fall in the river, which went slap right straight down. My brothers, though they were little fellows, had been used to paddling the canoe, and could have carried it safely anywhere about there, but this fellow Campbell wouldn't let them have the paddle, but fool-like undertook to manage it himself. I reckon he had never seen a watercraft before, and it went just any way but the way he wanted it. There he paddled and paddled and paddled, all the while going wrong, until in a short time here they were all going, straight forward, stern foremost, right plump to the falls, and if they had only had a fair shake, they would have gone over as slick as a whistle. It wasn't this, though, that scared me, for I was so infernal mad that they had left me on the shore that I had as soon as seen them all go over the falls a bit as any other way. But their danger was seen by a man by the name of Kendall. This man Kendall was working in a field on the bank, and knowing there was no time to lose, he started full tilt, and here he come like a cane brake afire. And as he ran, he threw off his coat, and then his jacket, and then his shirt, for I know when he got to the water he had nothing on but his breeches. But seeing him in such a hurry, and tearing off his clothes as he went, I had no doubt that the devil or something else was after him, and close on him too, as he was running within an inch of his life. This alarmed me, and I screamed out like a young painter. But Kendall didn't stop for this. When he came to the water, he plunged in, and where it was too deep to wade he would swim, and where it was shallow enough he went bolting on. And by such exertion as I never saw at any other time in my life, he reached the canoe, when it was within 20 or 30 feet of the falls, and so great was the suck and so swift the current that poor Kendall had a hard time of it to stop them at last. but he hung on to the canoe till he got it stopped, and then drew it out of danger. When they got out, I found the boys were more scared than I had been, and the only thing that comforted me was the belief that it was a punishment on them for leaving me on shore. Shortly after this, my father removed and settled in the same county about 10 miles above Greenville. There, another circumstance happened which made a lasting impression on my memory, though I was but a small child. Joseph Hawkins, who was a brother to my mother, was in the woods hunting for deer. He was passing near a thicket of brush in which one of our neighbors was gathering some grapes, as it was in the fall of the year and the grape season. The body of the man was hidden by the brush, and it was only as he would raise his hand to pull the bunches that any part of him could be seen. It was a likely place for deer, and my uncle, having no suspicion that it was any human being, but supposing the raising of the hand to be the occasional twitch of a deer's ear, fired at the lump, and as the devil would have it, unfortunately shot the man through the body. I saw my father draw a silk handkerchief through the bullet hole and entirely through his body. Yet after a while he got well, as little as anyone would have thought it. What became of him, or whether he is dead or alive, I don't know, but I reckon he didn't fancy the business of gathering grapes in an out-of-the-way thicket again. The next move my father made was to the mouth of Cove Creek, where he and a man by the name of Thomas Galbraith undertook to build a mill in partnership. They went on very well with their work until it was nigh done, when there came the second epistle to Noah's Fresh. And away went their mill, shot, lock, and barrel. I remember the water rose so high that it got up into the house we lived in, and my father moved us out of it to keep us from being drowned. I was now about 7 or 8 years old, and have a pretty distinct recollection of everything that was going on. From his bad luck in that business, and being ready to wash out from the mill building, my father again removed, and this time settled in Jefferson County, now in the state of Tennessee, where he opened a tavern on the road from Abingdon to Knoxville. His tavern was on a small scale, as he was poor, and the principal accommodations which he kept were for the wagoners who traveled the road. Here I remained with him until I was 12 years old, and about that time you may guess if you belong to Yankee land, or reckon if like me you belong to the backwoods, that I began to make up my acquaintance with hard times, and plenty of them. An old Dutchman by the name of Jacob Seiler, who was moving from Knox County to Rockbridge in the state of Virginia, in passing made a stop at my father's house. He had a large stock of cattle that he was carrying with him, and I suppose I made some proposition to my father to hire someone to assist him. Being hard run every way, and having no thought, as I believe, that I was cut out for a congressman or the like, young as I was, and as little as I knew about traveling, or being from home, he hired me to the old Dutchman to go 400 miles on foot, with a perfect stranger that I never had seen until the evening before. I set out with a heavy heart, it is true, but I went ahead until we arrived at the place, which was 3 miles from what is called the Natural Bridge, and made a stop at the house of a Mr. Hartley, who was father-in-law to Mr. Seiler, who had hired me. My Dutch master was very kind to me, and gave me $5 or $6, being pleased, as he said, with my services. This, however, I think was a bait for me, as he persuaded me to stay with him, and not return any more to my father. I had been taught so many lessons of obedience by my father that I at first supposed I was bound to obey this man, or at least I was afraid openly to disobey him. And I therefore stayed with him, and tried to put on a look of perfect contentment until I got the family all to believe I was fully satisfied. I had been there about 4 or 5 weeks, when one day myself and 2 other boys were playing on the roadside some distance from the house. There came along 3 wagons. One belonged to an old man by the name of Dunn, and the others to 2 of his sons. They had each of them a good team, and were all bound for Knoxville. They had been in the habit of stopping at my father's as they passed the road, and I knew them. I made myself known to the old gentleman, and informed him of my situation. I expressed a wish to get back to my father and mother if they could fix any plan for me to do so. They told me that they would stay that night at a tavern 7 miles from there, and that if I could get to them the next morning, they would take me home, and if I was pursued, they would protect me. This was a Sunday evening. I went back to the good old Dutchman's house, and as good fortune would have it, he and the family were out on a visit. I gathered my clothes and what little money I had and put them all together under the head of my bed. I went to bed early that night, but sleep seemed to be a stranger to me. For though I was a wild boy, yet I dearly loved my father and mother, and their images appeared to be so deeply fixed in my mind that I could not sleep thinking of them. And then the fear that when I should attempt to go out, I should be discovered and called to a halt, filled me with anxiety. And between my childish love of home on the one hand and the fears of which I have spoken on the other, I felt mighty queer. But so it was. About 3 hours before day in the morning, I got up to make my start. When I got out, I found it was snowing fast, and that the snow was then on the ground about 8 inches deep. I had not even the advantage of moonlight, and the whole sky was hidden by the falling snow, so I had to guess my way to the big road, which was about a half-mile from the house. I, however, pushed ahead, and soon got to it, and then pursued it, in the direction to the wagons. I could not have pursued the road if I had not guided myself by the opening it made between the timber, as the snow was too deep to leave any part of it to be known by either seeing or feeling. Before I overtook the wagons, the earth was covered about as deep as my knees, and my tracks filled so briskly after me that by daylight my Dutch master could have seen no trace which I left. I got to the place about an hour before. I found the wagoners already stirring and engaged in feeding and preparing their horses for a start. Mr. Dunn took me in and treated me with great kindness. My heart was more deeply impressed by meeting with such a friend and at such a time than by waiting the snowstorm by night or all the other sufferings which my mind had endured. I warmed myself by the fire, for I was very cold, and after an early breakfast we set out on our journey. The thoughts of home now began to take the entire possession of my mind, and I almost numbered the sluggish turns of the wheels, and much more certainly the miles of our travel, which appeared to me to count mighty slow. I continued with my kind protectors until we got to the house of a Mr. John Cole on Roanoke, when my impatience became so great that I determined to set out on foot and go ahead by myself, as I could travel twice as fast in that way as the wagons could. Mr. Dunn seemed very sorry to part with me, and used many arguments to prevent me from leaving him. But home, poor as it was, again rushed in my memory, and it seemed 10 times as dear to me as it ever had before. The reason was that my parents were there, and all that I had been accustomed to in the hours of childhood and infancy was there, and there my anxious little heart painted also to be. We remained at Mr. Cole's that night, and early in the morning I felt that I couldn't stay. So, taking leave of my friends the wagoners, I went forward on foot, until I was fortunately overtaken by a gentleman who was returning from market, to which he had been with a drove of horses. He had a lead horse, with a bridle and a saddle on him, and he kindly offered to let me get on his horse and ride him. I did so, and was glad of the chance, for I was tired, and was, moreover, near the first crossing of Roanoke, which I would have been compelled to wade, cold as the water was, if I had not fortunately met this good man. I traveled with him in this way, without anything turning up worth recording, until we got within 15 miles of my father's house. There we parted, and he went on to Kentucky, and I trudged on homeward, which place I reached that evening. The name of this kind gentleman I have entirely forgotten, and I am sorry for it deserves a high place in my little book. A remembrance of his kindness to a little straggling boy and a stranger to him has, however, a resting place in my heart, and there it will remain as long as I live. Chapter 2. Having gotten home, as I have just related, I remained with my father until the next fall, at which time he took it into his head to send me to a little country school, which was kept in the neighborhood by a man whose name was Benjamin Kitchen. I went for 4 days, and had just begun to learn my letters a little, when I had an unfortunate falling out with one of the scholars, a boy much larger and older than myself. I knew well enough that though the schoolhouse might do for a still hunt, it wouldn't do for a drive, and so I concluded to wait until I could get him out, and then I was determined to give him salt and vinegar. I waited till in the evening, and when the larger scholars were spelling, I slipped out, and going some distance along his road, I lay by the wayside in the bushes, waiting for him to come along. After a while he and his company came on sure enough, and I pitched out from the bushes and set on him like a wild cat. I scratched his face all to a flitterwig, and soon made him cry out for quarters in good earnest. The fight was over, I went home, and the next morning I started school again. But do you think I went? No, indeed. I was very clear of it, for I expected the master would lick me up as bad as I had the boy. So, instead of going to the schoolhouse, I laid out in the woods all day, until in the evening the scholars were dismissed, and my brothers, who were also going to school, came along, returning home. I wanted to conceal this whole business from my father, and I therefore persuaded them not to tell on me, which they agreed to. Things went on in this way for several days. I started with them to school in the morning, and returned with them in the evening, but lay out in the woods all day. At last, however, the master wrote a note to my father, inquiring why I was not sent to school. When he read this note, he called me up, and I knew very well that I was in a devil of a hobble, for my father had been taking a few horns, and was in a good condition to make the fur fly. He called on me to know why I had not been at school. I told him I was afraid to go, and that the master would whip me, for I knew quite well that if I was turned over to this old kitchen, I would be cooked up to a cracklin in little or no time. But I soon found that I was not to expect a much better fate at home, for my father told me in a very angry manner that he would whip me to an eternal sight worse than the master if I didn't start immediately at school. I tried again to beg off, but nothing would do but to go to the school. Finding me rather too slow about starting, he gathered about a 2-year-old hickory and broke after me. I put out with all my might, and soon we were both up to the top of our speed. We had a tolerably tough race for about a mile, but mind me, not on the schoolhouse road, for I was trying to get as far that other way as possible. And I yet believe, if my father and the schoolmaster could both have levied on me about that time, I should never have been called on to sit in the councils of the nation, for I think they would have used me up. But fortunately for me, about this time I saw just before me a hill over which I made headway, like a young steamboat. As soon as I had passed over it, I turned to one side and hid myself in the bushes. Here I waited until the old gentleman passed by, puffing and blowing as though his steam was high enough to burst his boilers. I waited until he gave up the hunt and passed back again. I then cut out and went to the house of an acquaintance a few miles off, who was just about to start with a drive. His name was Jesse Cheek, and I hired myself to go with him, determined not to return home, as home and the schoolhouse had both become too hot for me. I had an older brother, who was also hired to go with the same driver. We set out and went on through Abingdon and the county seat of Wythe County in the state of Virginia, and then through Lynchburg by Orange Courthouse and Charlottesville, passing through what was called Chester Gap onto a town called Front Royal, where my employer sold out his drove to a man by the name of Van Metre. And I was started homeward again in company with a brother of the first owner of the drove, with one horse between us, having left my brother to come on with the balance of the company. I traveled on with my new comrade about 3 days' journey, but much to his discredit, as I then thought, and still think, he took care all the time to ride, but never to tie. At last I told him to go ahead, and I would come when I got ready. He gave me $4 to bear my expenses upwards of 400 miles, and then cut out and left me. I purchased some provisions, and went on slowly, until at length I fell in with a wagoner, with whom I was disposed to scrape up a hasty acquaintance. I inquired where he lived, and where he was going, all about his affairs. He informed me that he lived in Greenville, Tennessee, and was on his way to a place called Gerardstown, 15 miles below Winchester. He also said that after he should make his journey to that place, he would immediately return to Tennessee. His name was Adam Myers, and a jolly good fellow he seemed to be. On a little reflection, I determined to turn back and go with him, which I did, and we journeyed on slowly as wagons commonly do, but merely enough. I often thought of home, and indeed wished bad enough to be there. But when I thought of the schoolhouse and kitchen, my master, and the race with my father, and the big hickory he carried, and of the fierceness of the storm of wrath that I had left him in, I was afraid to venture back, for I knew my father's nature so well that I was certain his anger would hang on to him like a turtle does to a fisherman's toe, and that if I went back in a hurry, he would give me the devil in 3 or 4 ways. But I and the wagon had traveled for 2 days when we met my brother, who I had left behind when the drive was sold out. He persuaded me to go home, but I refused. He pressed me hard and brought up a great many mighty strong arguments to induce me to turn back again. He pictured the pleasure of meeting my mother and my sisters, who all loved me dearly, and told me what uneasiness they had already suffered about me. I could not help shedding tears, which I did not often do, and my affections all pointed back to those dearest friends, and as I thought, nearly the only ones I had in the world. But then the promised whipping, that was the thing. It came right slap down on every thought of home, and I finally determined that make or break, hit or miss, I would just hang on to my journey and go ahead with the wagon. My brother was much grieved at our parting, but he went his way, and so did I. We went on until at last we got to Gerardstown, where the wagoner tried to get a back load, but he could not without going to Alexandria. He agreed to go there, and I concluded that I would wait until he returned. I set in to work for a man by the name of John Gray at 25 cents per day. My labor, however, was light, such as plowing in some small grain, in which I succeeded in pleasing the old man very well. I continued working for him until the wagoner got back, and for a good long time afterwards, as he continued to run his team back and forward, hauling to and from Baltimore. In the next spring, from the proceeds of my daily labor, small as it was, I was able to get me some decent clothes, and concluded I would make a trip with the wagon to Baltimore and see what sort of a place that was and what sort of folks lived there. I gave him the balance of what money I had for safekeeping, which, as well as I recollect, was about $7. We got on well enough until we came near Ellicott's Mills. Our load consisted of flour in barrels. Here I got into the wagon for the purpose of changing my clothing, not thinking that I was in any danger. But while I was in there, we were met by some wheelbarrow men who were working on the road, and the horses took a scare, and away they went, like they had seen a ghost. They made a sudden wheel around and broke the wagon tongue-slap short off as a pipe stem, and snap went both of the axle trees at the same time, and of all devilish flouncing about of flour barrels that ever was seen, I reckon this took the beat. Even a rat would have stood a bad chance in a straight race among them, and not much better in a crooked one, for he would have been in a good way to be ground up as fine as ginger by their rolling over him. But this proved to me that if a fellow is born to be hanged, he will never be drowned, and further, that if he is born for a seat in Congress, even flour barrels can't make a mash of him. All these dangers I escaped unhurt, though for a while I was afraid to say my soul was my own, for I didn't know how soon I would be knocked into a cocked hat and get my walking papers for another country. We put our load into another wagon and hauled ours to a workman's shop in Baltimore, having delivered the flour, and there we intended to remain for 2 or 3 days, which time was necessary to repair the runaway wagon. While I was there, I went one day down to the wharf and was very delighted to see the big ships and their sails all flying, for I had never seen any such things before, and indeed I didn't believe there were any such things in all nature. After a short time, my curiosity induced me to step aboard of one, where I was met by the captain, who asked me if I didn't wish to take a voyage to London. I told him I did, for by this time I had become pretty well weaned from home, and I cared but little where I was, or where I went, or what became of me. He said he wanted just such a boy as I was, which I was glad to hear. I told him I would go and get my clothes, and go with him. He inquired about my parents, where they lived, and all about them. I let him know that they lived in Tennessee, many hundred miles off. We soon agreed about my intended voyage, and I went back to my friend, the wagoner, and informed him that I was going to London, and wanted my money and clothes. He refused to let me have either, and swore that he would confine me and take me back to Tennessee. I took it to heart very much, but he kept so close and constant a watch over me that I found it impossible to escape from him until he had started homeward and made several days' journey on the road. He was, during this time, very ill to me, and threatened me with his wagon whip on several occasions. At length I resolved to leave him at all hazards, and so one morning I got my clothes out of his wagon and cut them out on foot without a farthing of money to bear my expenses. For all other friends having failed, I determined then to throw myself on Providence and see how that would use me. I had gone, however, only a few miles when I came up with another wagon, and such was my situation that I felt more than ever the necessity of endeavoring to find a friend. I therefore concluded I would seek one in him. He was going westwardly, and very kindly inquired of me where I was traveling. My youthful resolution, which had brooked almost everything else, rather gave way at this inquiry, for it brought the loneliness of my situation and everything else that was calculated to oppress me directly to view. My first answer to his question was in a sprinkle of tears, for if the world had been given to me, I could not, at that moment, have helped crying. As soon as the storm of feeling was over, I told him how I had been treated by the wagoner, but a little before, who kept what little money I had, and left me without a copper to buy even a morsel of food. He became exceedingly angry, and swore that he would make the other wagoner give up my money, pronouncing him a scoundrel, and many other hard names. I told him I was afraid to see him, for he had threatened me with his wagon whip, and I believed he would injure me. But my new friend was a very large, stout-looking man, and as resolute as a tiger. He bid me not to be afraid, still swearing he would have my money, or whip it out of the wretch who had it. We turned and went back about 2 miles, when we reached the place where he was. I went reluctantly, but I depended on my friend for protection. When we got there, I had but little to say, but approaching the wagon, my friend said to him, "You damned rascal, you have treated this boy badly." To which he replied, it was my fault. He was then asked if he did not get $7 of my money, which he confessed. It was then demanded of him, but he declared most solemnly that he hadn't that amount in the world, that he had spent my money and intended paying it back to me when we got to Tennessee. I then felt reconciled and persuaded my friend to let him alone, and we returned to his wagon, geared up, and started. His name I shall never forget while my memory lasts. It was Henry Myers. He lived in Pennsylvania, and I found him what he professed to be, a faithful friend and a clever fellow. We traveled together for several days, but at length I concluded to endeavor to make my way homeward, and for that purpose set out again, on foot and alone. But one thing I must not omit. The last night I stayed with Mr. Myers was at a place where several other wagoners also stayed. He told them, before we parted, that I was a poor little straggling boy, and how I had been treated, and that I was without money, though I had a long journey before me, through a land of strangers, where it was not even a wilderness. They were good enough to contribute a sort of money purse, and presented me with $3. On this amount I traveled as far as Montgomery Courthouse in the state of Virginia, where it gave out. I set to work for a man by the name of James Caldwell for $5 a month, which was about a shilling a day. When this time was out, I bound myself to a man by the name of Elijah Griffith by trading a hat, agreeing to work for him for 4 years. I remained with him about 18 months, when he found himself so involved in debt that he broke up and left the country. For this time I had received nothing, and was, of course, left without money, and with but very few clothes, and them very indifferent ones. I, however, set in again, and worked about as I could catch employment, until I got a little money and some clothing, and once more cut out for home. When I reached New River, at the mouth of a small stream called Little River, the white caps were flying so that I couldn't get anybody to attempt to put me across. I argued the case as well as I could, but they told me there was great danger of being capsized and drowned if I attempted to cross. I told them if I could get a canoe, I would venture, caps or no caps. They tried to persuade me out of it, but finding they could not, they agreed I might take a canoe, and so I did, and put off. I tied my clothes to the rope of the canoe to have them safe, whatever might happen. But I found it a mighty ticklish business, I tell you. When I got out fairly on the river, I would have given the world, if it had belonged to me, to have been on shore. But there was no time to lose now, so I was just determined to do the best I could, and the devil took the hindmost. I turned the canoe across the waves, to do which I had to turn it nearly up the river, as the wind came from that way, and I went about 2 miles before I could land. When I struck land, my canoe was about half full of water, and I was as wet as a drowned rat. But I was so much rejoiced that I scarcely felt the cold, though my clothes were frozen on me, and in this situation I had to go about 3 miles before I could find any house or fire to warm at. I, however, made out to get to one at last, and then I thought I would warm the inside a little, as well as the outside, so that there might be no grumbling. So I took a ladle of the Creator, that warmer of the cold and cooler of the hot, and it made me feel so good that I concluded it was like the black individual's rabbit. Good, anyway. I passed on until I arrived in Sullivan County, in the state of Tennessee, and there I met my brother, who had gone with me when I started from home with the cattle drive. I stayed with him a few weeks, and then went on to my father's, which place I reached late in the evening. Several wagons were there for the night, and considerable company about the house. I inquired if I could stay all night, for I did not intend to make myself known until I saw whether any of the family would find me out. I was told that I could stay, and went in, but had mighty little to say to anybody. I had been gone so long and had grown so much that the family did not at first know me. And another, and perhaps a stronger reason was, they had no thought or expectation of me, for they all had long given me up for finally lost. After a while, we were all called to supper. I went with the rest. We had all sat down at the table and begun to eat, when my eldest sister recollected me. She sprung up, ran, and seized me around the neck, and exclaimed, "Here is my lost brother." My feelings at this time would be vain and foolish for me to attempt to describe. I had often thought I felt before, and I suppose I had, but sure I am, I never had felt as I then did. The joy of my sisters and my mother, and indeed of all the family, was such that it humbled me, and made me sorry that I hadn't submitted to 100 whippings, sooner than cause so much affliction as they had suffered on my account. I found the family had never heard a word of me from the time my brother left me. I was now almost 15 years old, and my increased age and size, together with the joy of my father, occasioned by my unexpected return, I was sure would secure me against my long-dreaded whipping. And so they did. But it will be a source of astonishment to many who reflect that I am now a member of the American Congress, the most enlightened body of men in the world, that at such an advanced age, the age of 15, I did not know the first letter in the book. Chapter 3. I had remained for some short time at home with my father when he informed me that he owed a man, whose name was Abraham Wilson, the sum of $36, and that if I would set in and work out the note, so as to lift it for him, he would discharge me from his service, and I might go free. I agreed to do this, and went immediately to the man who held my father's note, and contracted with him to work 6 months for it. I set in and worked with all my might, not losing a single day in the 6 months. When my time was out, I got my father's note, and then declined working with the man any longer, though he wanted to hire me. The reason was, it was a place where heaps of bad company met to drink and gamble, and I wanted to get away from them, for I know very well if I stayed there I would get a bad name, as nobody could be respectable that would live there. I therefore returned to my father and gave him up his paper, which seemed to please him mightily, for though he was poor, he was an honest man, and always tried mighty hard to pay off his debts. I next went to the house of an honest old Quaker by the name of John Kennedy, who had removed from North Carolina, and proposed to hire myself to him at 2 shillings a day. He agreed to take me a week on trial, at the end of which he appeared pleased with my work and informed me that he held a note on my father for $40, and that he would give me that note if I worked for him for 6 months. I was certain enough that I should never get any part of the note, but then I remembered it was my father that owed it, and I concluded it was my duty as a child to help him along, and ease his lot as much as I could. I told the Quaker I would take him up at his offer, and immediately went to work. I never visited my father's house during the whole time of this engagement, though he lived only 15 miles off. But when it was finished, and I had got the note, I borrowed one of my employer's horses, and on a Sunday evening went to pay my parents a visit. Some time after I got there, I pulled out the note and handed it to my father, who supposed Mr. Kennedy had sent it for collection. The old man looked mighty sorry, and said to me he did not have the money to pay for it, and didn't know what he should do. I then told him I had paid it for him, and it was then his own, that it was not presented for collection, but as a present from me. At this he shed a heap of tears, and as soon as he got a little over it, he said he was sorry he couldn't give me anything, but he was not able, he was too poor. The next day I went back to my old friend, the Quaker, and set in to work for him for some clothes, for I had now worked a year without getting any money at all, and my clothes were nearly all worn out, and what few I had left were mighty indifferent. I worked in this way for about 2 months, and in that time a young woman from North Carolina, who was the Quaker's niece, came on a visit to his house. And now I am just getting on with a part of my history that I know I can never forget. For though I have heard people talk about hard loving, yet I reckon no poor devil in this world was ever cursed with such hard love as mine has always been when it came on me. I soon found myself head over heels in love with this girl, whose name the public could make no use of, and I thought that if all the hills about there were pure chink, and all belonged to me, I would give them if I could just talk to her as I wanted to. But I was afraid to begin, for when I would think of saying anything to her, my heart would begin to flutter like a duck in a puddle, and if I tried to outdo it and speak, would get right smack up in my throat, and choke me like a cold potato. It bore on my mind in this way, till at last I concluded I must die if I didn't broach the subject. And so I was determined to begin and hang on trying to speak, till my heart would get out of my throat one way or t'other. And so one day at it I went, and after several trials I could say a little. I told her how well I loved her, that she was the darling object of my soul and body, and I must have her, or else I should pine down to nothing and just die away with the consumption. I found my talk was not disagreeable to her, but she was an honest girl and didn't want to deceive anybody. She told me she was engaged to her cousin, a son of the old Quaker. This news was worse to me than war, pestilence, or famine, but still I knowed I could not help myself. I saw quickly enough my cake was dough, and I tried to cool off as fast as possible, but I had hardly enough safety pipes, as my love was so hot, as mighty night, to burst my boilers. But I didn't press my claims any more, seeing there was no chance to do anything. I began to think that all my misfortunes growed out of my want to learn. I had never been to school but 4 days, as the reader has already seen, and did not yet know a letter. I thought I would try to go to school some, and as the Quaker had a married son who was living about 1.5 miles from him, and keeping a school, I proposed to him that I would go to school 4 days in the week, and work for him the other 2, to pay my board and schooling. He agreed I might come on those terms, and so at it I went, learning and working back and forwards, until I had been with him nigh on to 6 months. In this time I learned to read a little in my primer, to write my own name, and to cipher some in the 3 first rules in figures. And this was all the schooling I ever had in my life, up to this day. I should have continued longer, if it hadn't been that I concluded I couldn't do any longer without a wife, and so I cut out to hunt me one. I found a family of very pretty little girls that I had known when very young. They had lived in the same neighborhood with me, and I had thought very well of them. I made an offer to one of them, whose name is nobody's business, no more than the Quaker girl's, and I found she took it very well. I still continued paying my respects to her until I got to love her as bad as I had the Quaker's niece, and I would have agreed to fight a whole regiment of wild cats if she would only have said she would have me. Several months passed in this way, during which time she continued to be very kind and friendly. At last the son of the old Quaker and my first girl had concluded to bring their matter to a close, and my own little queen and myself were called on to wait on them. We went on the day and performed our duty as attendants. This made me worse than ever, and after it was over I pressed my claim very hard on her, but she would still give me a sort of evasive answer. However, I gave her a mighty little piece, till she told me at last she would have me. I thought this was glorification enough, even without spectacles. I was then about 18 years old. We fixed the time to be married, and I thought if that day comes, I should be the happiest man in the created world, or on the moon, or anywhere else. I had by this time got to be mighty fond of the rifle, and had bought a capital one. I most generally carried her with me wherever I went, and though I had got back to the old Quaker's to live, who was a very particular man, I would sometimes slip out and attend the shooting matches where they shot for beef. I always tried, though, to keep it a secret from him. He had at the same time a bound boy living with him, who I had gotten into almost as great a notion of the girls as myself. He was about my own age, and was deeply smitten with the sister to my intended wife. I knowed it was in vain to try to get the leave of the old man for my young associate to go with me on any of my courting frolics. But I thought I could fix a plan to have him along, which would not injure the Quaker, as we had no notion that he should ever know it. We commonly slept upstairs, and at the gable end of the house there was a window. So one Sunday, when the old man and his family were all gone to meeting, we went out and cut a long pole, and taking it to the house, we set it up on one end in the corner, reaching up the chimney as high as the window. After this, we would go upstairs to bed, and then putting on our Sunday clothes, would go out at the window and climb down the pole, take a horse apiece, and ride about 10 miles to where his sweetheart lived, and the girl I claimed as my wife. I was always mighty careful to be back before day, so as to escape being found out. And in this way I continued my attention very closely until a few days before I was to be married, or at least thought I was, for I had no fear that anything was about to go wrong. Just now I heard of a shooting match in the neighborhood, right between where I lived and my girl's house, and I was determined to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, to go to the shooting match first, and then to see her. I therefore made the Quaker believe I was going to hunt for deer, as they were pretty much in those parts, but instead of hunting them, I went straight on to the shooting match, where I joined in with a partner, and we put in several shots for the beef. I was mighty lucky, and when the match was over, I had won the whole beef. This was on a Saturday, and my success had put me in the finest humor in the world. So I sold my part of the beef for $5 in the real grit, for I believe that was before banknotes were invented. At least I had never heard of any. I now started to ask for my wife, for though the next Thursday was our wedding day, I had never said a word to her parents about it. I had always dreaded the undertaking so badly that I had put the evil hour off as long as possible. And indeed, I calculated they knowed me so well, they wouldn't raise any objections to having me for their son-in-law. I had a great deal better opinion of myself, I found, than other people had of me. But I moved on with a light heart, and my $5 jingling in my pocket, thinking all the time there were but few greater men in the world than myself. In this flow of good humor, I went ahead, till I got within about 2 miles of the place, when I concluded I would stop a while at the house of the girl's uncle, where I might inquire about the family and so forth and so on. I was indeed just about ready to consider her uncle, my uncle, and her affairs, my affairs. When I went in, though, I found her sister there. I asked how all was at home. In a minute I found from her countenance something was wrong. She looked mortified, and didn't answer as quickly as I thought she ought, being it was her brother-in-law talking to her. However, I asked her again. She then burst into tears, and told me her sister was going to deceive me, and that she was to be married to another man the next day. This was as sudden to me as a clap of thunder of a bright sunshiny day. It was the capstone of all the afflictions I had ever met with, and it seemed to me that it was more than any human creature could endure. It struck me perfectly speechless for some time and made me feel so weak that I thought I should sink down. I, however, recovered from my shock after a little and rose and started without any ceremony or even bidding anybody goodbye. The young woman followed me out to the gate and entreated me to go on to her father's, and said she would go with me. She said the young man, who was going to marry her sister, had got his license and had asked for her, but she assured me her father and mother both preferred me to him, and that she had no doubt but that if I would go on, I could break off the match. But I found I could go no further. My heart was bruised and my spirits were broken down, so I bid her farewell and turned my lonesome and miserable steps back again homeward, concluding that I was only born for hardships, misery, and disappointment. I now began to think that in making me, it was entirely forgotten to make my mate, that I was born odd and should always remain so, and that nobody would have me. But all these reflections did not satisfy my mind, for I had no peace day nor night for several weeks. My appetite failed me, and I grew worse and worse. They all thought I was sick, and so I was. And it was the worst kind of sickness, a sickness of the heart and all the tender parts produced by disappointed love. Chapter 4. I continued in this down-spirited situation for a good long time, until one day I took my rifle and started hunting. While out, I made a call at the house of a Dutch widow who had a daughter that was well enough as to smartness, but she was as ugly as a stone fence. She was, however, quite talkative, and soon began to laugh at me about my disappointment. She seemed disposed, though, to comfort me as much as she could, and for that purpose told me to keep in good heart, that there was as good fish in the sea as had ever been caught out of it. I doubted this very much, but whether or not, I was certain that she was not one of them, for she was so homely that it almost gave me a pain in the eyes to look at her. But I couldn't help thinking that she had intended what she had said as a banter for me to court her. The last thing in creation I could have thought of doing. I felt a little inclined to talk on the subject, it is true, but, to pass the time, I told her I thought I was born odd, and that no fellow could be found. She protested against this, and said if I would come to their reaping, which was not far off, she would show me one of the prettiest little girls there I had ever seen. She added that the one who had deceived me was nothing to be compared with her. I didn't believe a word of all this, for I had thought that such a piece of flesh and blood as she was had never been manufactured, and never would again. I agreed with her, though, that the little variant had treated me so bad that I ought to forget her, and yet I couldn't do it. I concluded the best way to accomplish it was to cut out again, and see if I could find any other that would answer me. And so I told the Dutch girl I would be at the reaping, and would bring as many as I could with me. I employed my time pretty generally in giving information about it, as far as I could, until the day came, and I then offered to work for my old friend, the Quaker, for 2 days, if he would let his bound boy go with me to the reaping. He refused, and reproved me pretty roughly for my proposition, and said if he was in my place he wouldn't go, that there would be a great deal of bad company there, and that I had been so good a boy he would be sorry for me to get a bad name. But I knowed my promise to the Dutch girl, and I was resolved to fulfill it, so I shouldered my rifle and started by myself. When I got to the place I found a large company of men and women, and among them an old Irish woman who had a great deal to say. I soon found out from my Dutch girl that this old lady was the mother of the little girl she had promised me, though I had not yet seen her. She was in an outhouse with some other youngsters, and had not yet made her appearance. Her mamma, however, was no way bashful. She came up to me and began to praise my red cheeks, and said she had a sweetheart for me. I had no doubt she had been told what I come for, and all about it. In the evening I was introduced to her daughter, and I must confess I was pleased with her from the word go. She had a good countenance and was very pretty, and I was fully bent on making up an acquaintance with her. It was not long before the dancing commenced, and I asked her to join me in a reel. She very readily consented to do so, and after we had finished our dance, I took a seat alongside her and entered into a talk. I found her very interesting. While I was sitting by her, making as good a use of my time as I could, her mother came to us, and very jocularly called me her son-in-law. This rather confused me, but I looked on it as a joke of the old lady, and tried to turn it off as well as I could. But I took care to pay as much attention to her through the evening as I could. I went on the old saying of salting the cow to catch the calf. I soon became so pleased with this little girl that I began to think the Dutch girl had told me the truth when she said there were still good fish in the sea. We continued our frolic till near day, when we joined in some plays, calculated to amuse youngsters. I had not often spent a more agreeable night. In the morning, however, we all had to part, and I found my mind had become much better reconciled than it had been for a long time. I went home to the Quaker's and made a bargain to work with his son for a low-priced horse. He was the first one I had ever owned, and I was to work 6 months for him. I had been engaged very closely for 5 or 6 weeks when this little girl ran in my mind, so I concluded I must go and see her and find out what sort of people they were at home. I mounted my horse, and away I went to where she lived, and when I got there I found her father a very clever old man, and the old woman as talkative as ever. She wanted badly to find out all about me, and as I thought to see how I would do for her girl. I hadn't yet seen her, and I began to feel some anxiety to know where she was. In a short time, however, my impatience was relieved as she arrived at home from a meeting to which she had been. There was a young man with her, who I soon found was disposed to set up a claim to her, as he was so attentive to her that I could hardly get to slip in a word edgeways. I began to think I was barking up the wrong tree again, but I was determined to stand up to my rack, fodder or no fodder. And so, to know her mind a little on the subject, I began to talk about starting, as I knowed she would then show some sign, from which I could understand which way the wind blew. It was then at night, and my distance was 15 miles home. At this my little girl soon began to indicate to the other gentleman that his room would be the better part of his company. At length she left him and came to me, and insisted mighty hard that I should not go that evening, and indeed, from all her actions and the attempts she made to get rid of him, I saw that she preferred me all holler. But it wasn't long before I found enough trouble in another quarter. Her mother was deeply enlisted for my rival, and I had to fight against her influence as well as his. But the girl herself was the prize I was fighting for, and as she welcomed me, I was determined to lay siege to her, let what would happen. I commenced a close courtship, having cornered her from her old beau, while he set off, looking on, like a poor man at a country frolic, and all the time almost gritting his teeth with pure disappointment. But he didn't dare to attempt anything more, for now I had gotten a start, and I looked at him every once in a while as fierce as a wildcat. I stayed with her until Monday morning, and then I left for home. It was about 2 weeks after this that I was sent to engage in a wolf hunt, where a great number of men were to meet, with their dogs and guns, and where the best sort of sport was expected. I went as large as life, but I had to hunt in strange woods, and in a part of the country which was very thinly inhabited. While I was out, it clouded up, and I began to get scared, and in a little while I was so much so that I didn't know which way home was, nor anything about it. I set out the way I thought it was, but it turned out with me, as it always does with a lost man, I was wrong, and took exactly the opposite direction from the right one. And for the information of young hunters, I will just say, in this place, that whenever a fellow gets badly lost, the way home is just the way he doesn't think it is. This rule will hit 9 times out of 10. I went ahead, though, about 6 or 7 miles, when I found night was coming on fast. But at this distressing time I saw a little woman streaking it along through the woods like all wrath. And so I cut on too, for I was determined I wouldn't lose sight of her that night any more. I ran on till she saw me, and she stopped, for she was as glad to see me as I was to see her, as she was lost as well as me. When I came up to her, who should she be but my little girl, that I had been paying my respects to. She had been out hunting her father's horses, and had missed her way, and had no knowledge where she was, or how far it was to any house, or what way would take us there. She had been traveling all day, and was mighty tired, and I would have taken her up and toasted her, if it hadn't been that I wanted her just where I could see her all the time, for I thought she looked sweeter than sugar, and by this time I loved her almost well enough to eat her. At last I came to a path that I knew must go somewhere, and so we followed it till we came to a house at about dark. Here we stayed all night. I sat up all night courting, and in the morning we parted. She went to her home, from which we were distant about 7 miles, and I to mine, which was 10 miles off. I now turned in to work again, and it was about 4 weeks before I went back to see her. I continued to go occasionally until I had worked long enough to pay for my horse by putting in my gun with my work to the man I had purchased from. And then I began to count whether I was to be deceived again or not. At our next meeting we set the day for our wedding, and I went to my father's and made arrangements for an affair, and returned to ask her parents for her. When I got there, the old lady appeared to be mighty wrathy, and when I broached the subject, she looked at me as savage as a meat-axe. The old man appeared quite willing, and treated me very cleverly. But I hadn't been there long before the old woman as good as ordered me out of her house. I thought I would put her in mind of old times, and see how that would go with her. I told her she had called me her son-in-law before I had attempted to call her my mother-in-law, and I thought she ought to cool off. But her Irish was too high to do anything with her, and so I quit trying. All I cared for was to have her daughter on my side, which I knowed was the case then. But how soon some other fellow might knock my nose out of joint again, I couldn't tell. I, however, felt rather insulted at the old lady, and I thought I wouldn't get married in her house. And so I told her girl that I would come the next Thursday, and bring a horse, a bridle, and a saddle for her, and she must be ready to go. Her mother declared I shouldn't have her, but I know I should, if somebody else didn't get her before Thursday. I then started, bidding them good-bye, and went by the house of a justice of the peace who lived on the way to my father's, and made a bargain with him to marry me. When Thursday came, all necessary arrangements were made at my father's to receive my wife, and so I took my eldest brother and his wife, and another brother, and a single sister that I had, and 2 other young men with me, and cut out to her father's house to get her. We went on until we got within 2 miles of the place, where we met a large company that had heard of the wedding and were waiting. Some of that company went on with my brother and sister and the young man I had picked out to wait on me. When they got there, they found the old lady as wealthy as ever. However, the old man filled their bottle, and the young men returned in a hurry. I then went on with my company, and when I arrived, I never pretended to dismount from my horse, but rode up to the door and asked the girl if she was ready, and she said she was. I then told her to light on the horse I was leading, and she did so. Her father, though, had gone out to the gate, and when I started, he commenced persuading me to stay and marry there, that he was entirely willing to the match, and that his wife, like most women, had entirely too much tongue, but that I oughtn't to mind her. I told him if she would ask me to stay and marry at her house, I would do so. With that, he sent for her, and after they had talked for some time by themselves, she came to me and looked at me mighty good, and asked my pardon for what she had said, and invited me to stay. She said it was the first child she had ever had to marry, and she couldn't bear to see her go off in that way, that if I would light, she would do the best she could for us. I couldn't stand everything, and so I agreed, and we got down and went in. I sent it off to my person and got married in a short time, for I was afraid to wait long for fear of another defeat. We had as good treatment as could be expected, and that night all went on well. The next day we cut out for my father's, where we met a large company of people that had been waiting a day and a night for our arrival. We passed the time quite merrily until the company broke up, and having gotten my wife, I thought I was completely made up and needed nothing more in the whole world. But I soon found this was all a mistake, for now, having a wife, I wanted everything else, and worse than all, I had nothing to give for it. I remained a few days at my father's, and then went back to my new father-in-law's, where, to my surprise, I found my old Irish mother in the finest humor in the world. She gave us 2 likely cows and calves, which, though it was a small marriage portion, was still better than I had expected, and indeed it was about all I ever got. I rented a small farm and cabin and went to work. But I had much trouble to find out a plan to get anything to put in my house. At this time, my good friend the Quaker came forward to my assistance and gave me an order to a store for $15 worth of such things as my little wife might choose. With this, we fixed up pretty grand, as we thought, and allowed to get on very well. My wife had a good wheel and knew exactly how to use it. She was also a good weaver, as most of the Irish are, whether men or women, and being very industrious with her wheel, she had, in little or no time, a fine web of cloth ready to make up. And she was good at that too, and at almost anything else that a woman could do. We worked on for some years, renting ground and paying high rent, until I found it wasn't the thing it was cracked up to be, and that I couldn't make a fortune at it just at all. So I concluded to quit it and cut out for some new country. In this time we had 2 sons, and I found I was better at increasing my family than my fortune. It was therefore necessary that I should hunt for a better place to get along, and as I knowed I would have to move at some time, I thought it was better to do it before my family got too large, so that I might have less to carry. The Duck and Elk River country was just beginning to settle, and I was determined to try that. I had 1 old horse and a couple of 2-year-old colts. They were both broken to the halter, and my father-in-law proposed that, if I went, he would go with me, and take 1 horse to help me move. So we all fixed up, and I packed my 2 colts with as many of my things as they could bear, and away we went across the mountains. We got on well enough, and arrived safely in Lincoln County, on the head of the Mulberry Fork of Elk River. I found this a very rich country, and so new that there were many different kinds of games. It was here that I began to distinguish myself as a hunter and to lay the foundation for all my future greatness. But mighty little did I know of what sort it was going to be. Of deer and smaller game I killed in abundance, but the bear had been much hunted in those parts before, and were not so plentiful as I could have wished. I lived here in the years 1809 and 10, to the best of my recollection, and then I moved to Franklin County and settled on Bean Creek, where I remained till after the close of the last war. Chapter 5. I was living 10 miles below Winchester when the Creek War commenced, and as military men are making so much fuss in the world at this time, I must give an account of the part I took in the defense of the country. If it should make me president, why can't I help it? Such things will sometimes happen, and my pluck is never to seek nor decline office. It is true I had a little rather not, but yet, if the government can't get on without taking another president from Tennessee to finish the work of retrenchment and reform, why then, I reckon I must go in for it. But I must begin with the war and leave the other matter for the people to begin on. The Creek Indians had commenced their open hostilities by a most bloody butchery at Fort Mims. There had been no war among us for so long, but few, who were not too old to bear arms, knew anything about the business. I, for one, had often thought about war, and had often heard it described, and I did verily believe in my own mind that I couldn't fight in that way at all, but my after experience convinced me that this was all a notion. For when I heard of the mischief which was done at the fort, I instantly felt like going, and I had none of the dread of dying that I expected to feel. In a few days, a general meeting of the militia was called for the purpose of raising volunteers, and when the day arrived for that meeting, my wife, who had heard me say I meant to go to the war, began to beg me not to turn out. She said she was a stranger in the parts where we lived, had no connections living near her, and that she and our little children would be left in a lonesome and unhappy situation if I went away. It was mighty hard to go against such arguments as these, but my countrymen had been murdered, and I knew that the next thing would be that the Indians would be scalping the women and the children all about there, if we didn't put a stop to it. I reasoned the case with her as well as I could, and told her that if every man would wait till his wife got willing for him to go to war, there would be no fighting done until we would all be killed in our own houses. That I was as able to go as any man in the world, and that I believed it was a duty I owed to my country. Whether she was satisfied with this reasoning or not, she did not tell me. But seeing I was bent on it, all she did was to cry a little and turn about to her work. The truth is, my dander was up, and nothing but war could bring it right again. I went to Winchester, where the muster was to be, and a great many people had collected, for there was as much fuss among the people about the war as there is now about moving the deposits. When the men were paraded, a lawyer by the name of Jones addressed us, and closed by turning out himself, and inquiring at the same time who among us felt like we could fight Indians. This was the same Mr. Jones who afterwards served in Congress from the state of Tennessee. He informed us he wished to raise a company, and that then the men should meet and elect their own officers. I believe I was about the second or third man that stepped out, but on marching up and down the regiment a few times, we found we had a large company. We volunteered for 60 days, as it was supposed our services would no longer be wanted. A day or two after this we met, and elected Mr. Jones our captain, and also elected our other officers. We then received orders to start on the next Monday week, before which time I had fixed as well as I could to go, and my wife had equipped me as well as she was able for the camp. When the time arrived, I took a parting farewell to my wife and my little boys, mounted my horse, and set sail to join my company. Expecting to be gone only a short time, I took no more clothing with me than I supposed would be necessary, so that if I got into an Indian battle, I might not be pestered with any unnecessary plunder to prevent my having a fair shake with them. We all met and went ahead till we passed Huntsville and camped at a large spring called Beatty's Spring. Here we stayed for several days, in which time the troops began to collect from all quarters. At last we mustered about 1,300 strong, all mounted volunteers, and all determined to fight, judging from myself, for I felt wolfish all over. I verily believe the whole army was of real grit. Our captain didn't want any other sort, and to try them he several times told his men that if any of them wanted to go back home, they might do so at any time, before they were regularly mustered into the service. But he had the honor to command all his men from first to last, as not one of them left him. General Jackson had not yet left Nashville with his old foot volunteers that had gone with him to Natchez in 1812, the year before. While we remained in the spring, Major Gibson came and wanted some volunteers to go with him across the Tennessee River and into the Creek Nation to find out the movements of the Indians. He came to my captain and asked for 2 of his best woodsmen, and such as were best with a rifle. The captain pointed me out to him and said he would be sure that I would go as far as the major would himself, or any other man. I willingly agreed to go with him, and asked him to let me choose my own mate to go with me, which he said I might do. I chose a young man by the name of George Russell, a son of old Major Russell of Tennessee. I called him up, but Major Gibson said he thought he hadn't beard enough to please him. He wanted men, and not boys. I must confess I was a little nettled at this, for I knew George Russell, and I knew there was no mistake in him. And I didn't think that courage ought to be measured by the beard, for fear a goat would have the preference over a man. I told the major he was on the wrong scent, that Russell could go as far as he would, and I must have him along. He saw I was a little wrathy, and said I had the best chance of knowing, and agreed that it should be as I wanted it. He told us to be ready early in the morning for a start, and so we were. We took our camp equipment, mounted our horses, and 13 in number, including the major, we cut out. We went on and crossed the Tennessee River at a place called Ditto's Landing, and then traveled about 7 miles further and took up camp for the night. Here a man by the name of John Haynes overtook us. He had been an Indian trader in that part of the nation, and was well acquainted with it. He went with us as a pilot. The next morning, however, Major Gibson and myself concluded we should separate and take different directions to see what discoveries we could make. So he took 7 of the men, and I 5, making 13 in all, including myself. He was to go by the house of a Cherokee Indian named Dick Brown, and I was to go by Dick's father's, and getting all the information we could, we were to meet that evening where the roads came together, 15 miles the other side of Brown's. At old Mr. Brown's, I got a half-blood Cherokee to agree to go with me, whose name was Jack Thompson. He was not then ready to start, but was to fix that evening and overtake us at the fork road where I was to meet Major Gibson. I knew it wouldn't be safe to camp right at the road, and so I told Jack that when he got to the fork he must holler like an owl, and I would answer him in the same way, for I knew it would be night before he got there. I and my men then started and went on to the place of meeting, but Major Gibson was not there. We waited till almost dark, but still he didn't come. We then left the Indian trace a little distance, and turning into the head of a hollow, we struck up camp. It was about 10 o'clock at night when I heard my owl, and I answered him. Jack soon found us, and we decided to rest there during the night. We also stayed the next morning till after breakfast, but in vain, for the Major still didn't come. I told the men we had set out to hunt a fight, and I wouldn't go back in that way, that we must go ahead and see what the red men were at. We started and went to a Cherokee town about 20 miles off, and after a short stay there, we pushed on to the house of a man by the name of Radcliffe. He was a white man, but had married a Creek woman and lived just on the edge of the Creek Nation. He had 2 sons, likely fellows, and a great deal of potatoes and corn, and indeed almost everything else to go on. So we fed our horses and got dinner with him, and seemed to be doing mighty well. But he was scared all the time. He told us there had been 10 painted warriors at his house only an hour before, and if we were discovered there, they would kill us, and his family with us. I replied to him that my business was to hunt for just such fellows as he had described, and I was determined not to go back until I had done it. Our dinner being over, we saddled up our horses and made ready to start. But some of my small companies, I found, were disposed to return. I told them if we were to go back then, we should never hear the last of it, and I was determined to go ahead. I knowed some of them would go with me, and that the rest were afraid to go back by themselves. And so we pushed on to the camp of some of the friendly Creeks, which was about 8 miles away. The moon was about the full, and the night was clear. We therefore had the benefit of her light from night to morning, and I knew if we were placed in such danger as to make a retreat necessary, we could travel by night as well as in the daytime. We had not gone very far when we met 2 black individuals, well mounted on Indian ponies, and each with a good rifle. They had been taken from their owners by the Indians, and were running away from them and trying to get back to their masters again. They were brothers, both very large and likely, and could talk Indian as well as English. One of them I sent on to Ditto's Landing, the other I took back with me. It was after dark when we got to the camp, where we found about 40 men, women, and children. They had bows and arrows, and I turned into shooting with their boys with a pine light. In this way we amused ourselves very well for a while, but at last the black individual who had been talking to the Indians came to me and told me they were very much alarmed, for the Red Sticks, as they called the war party of the Creeks, would come and find us there, and if so, we should all be killed. I directed him to tell them that I would watch, and if one would come that night, I would carry the skin of his head home to make me a moccasin. When he made this communication, the Indians laughed aloud. At about 10 o'clock at night, we all concluded to try to sleep a little, but that our horses might be ready for use, as the treasurer said of the drafts on the United States' bank, on certain contingencies, we tied them up with our saddles on them and everything to our hand if in the night our quarters should get uncomfortable. We lay down with our guns in our arms, and I had just gotten into a dose of sleep when I heard the sharpest scream that ever escaped the throat of a human creature. It was more like a wrathy painter than anything else. The black individual understood it, and he sprang to me, for though I heard the noise well enough, yet I wasn't wide awake enough to get up. So the black individual caught me and said the Red Sticks was coming. I rose quicker then and asked what was the matter. Our black individual had gone and talked with the Indian who had just fetched the scream, as he come into camp, and learned from him that the war party had been crossing the Coosa River all day at the 10 Islands, and were going on to meet Jackson, and this Indian had come as a runner. This news very much alarmed the friendly Indians in camp, and they were all off in a few minutes. I felt bound to make this intelligence known as soon as possible to the army we had left at the landing, and so we all mounted our horses and put out in a long lope to make our way back to that place. We were about 65 miles off. We went on to the same Cherokee town we had visited on our way out, having first called at Radcliffe's, who was off with his family, and at the town we found large fires burning, but not a single Indian was to be seen. They were all gone. These circumstances were calculated to lay our dander a little, as it appears we must be in great danger, though we could easily have licked any force of not more than 5 to 1. But we expected the whole nation would be on us, and against such fearful odds we were not so rampant for a fight. We therefore stayed only a short time in the light of the fires about the town, preferring the light of the moon and the shade of the woods. We pushed on till we got again to old Mr. Brown's, which was still about 30 miles from where we had left the main army. When we got there, the chickens were just at the first crowing for the day. We fed our horses, got a morsel to eat ourselves, and again cut out. About 10 o'clock in the morning we reached the camp, and I reported to Colonel. Coffee the news. He didn't seem to mind my report a bit, and this raised my dander higher than ever. But I knowed I had to be on my best behavior, and so I kept it all to myself, though I was so mad that I was burning inside like a tar kiln, and I wondered that the smoke hadn't been pouring out of me at all points. Major Gibson hadn't yet returned, and we all began to think he was killed. And that night they put out a double guard. The next day the Major got in and brought a worse tale than I had, though he stated the same facts so far as I went. This seemed to put our colonel all in a fidget, and it convinced me clearly of one of the hateful ways of the world. When I made my report, it wasn't believed, because I was no officer. I was no great man, but just a poor soldier. But when the same thing was reported by Major Gibson, why then it was all as true as preaching, and the colonel believed it every word. He, therefore, ordered breastworks to be thrown up near a quarter of a mile long, and sent an express to Fayetteville, where General Jackson and his troops were, requesting them to push on like the very mischief, for fear we should all be cooked up to a cracklin' before they could get there. Old Hickory Face made a forced march on getting the news, and on the next day he and his men got into camp, with their feet all blistered from the effects of their swift journey. The volunteers, therefore, stood guard all together to let them rest. Chapter 6. About 800 of the volunteers, and of that number I was one, were now sent back, crossing the Tennessee River and on through Huntsville, so as to cross the river again at another place, and to get on the Indians in another direction. After we passed Huntsville, we struck on the river at the Muscle Shoals, and at a place on them called Melton's Bluff. This river is about 2 miles wide and a rough bottom, so much so, indeed, in many places, as to be dangerous, and in forcing it this time we left several of the horses belonging to our men, with their feet fast in the crevices of the rocks. The men, whose horses were thus left, went ahead on foot. We pushed on till we got to what was called the Black Warriors' Town, which stood near the very spot where Tuscaloosa now stands, which is the seat of government for the state of Alabama. This Indian town was a large one, but when we arrived, we found the Indians had all left it. There was a large field of corn standing out, and a pretty good supply in some cribs. There was also a fine quantity of dried beans, which were very acceptable to us, and without delay we secured them as well as the corn, and then burned the town to ashes, after which we left the place. In the field where we gathered the corn we saw plenty of Indian tracks, and we had no doubt they had been scared off by our arrival. We then went on to meet the main army at the Fork Road, where I was first to have met Major Gibson. We got that evening as far back as the encampment we had made the night before we reached the Black Warriors' town, which we had just destroyed. The next day we were entirely out of meat. I went to Colonel Coffee, who was then in command of us, and asked his leave to hunt as we marched. He gave me leave, but told me to take mighty good care of myself. I turned aside to hunt, and hadn't gone far when I found a deer that had just been killed and skinned, and his flesh was still warm and smoking. From this I was sure that the Indian who had killed it had been gone only a very few minutes, and though I was never much in favor of one hunter stealing from another, yet meat was so scarce in camp that I thought I must go in for it. So I just took up the deer on my horse before me and carried it on till night. I could have sold it for almost any price I would have asked, but this wasn't my rule, neither in peace nor war. Whenever I had anything and saw a fellow being suffering, I was more anxious to relieve him than to benefit myself. And this is one of the true secrets of my being a poor man to this day. But it is my way, and while it has often left me with an empty purse, which is as near the devil as anything else I have seen, yet it has never left my heart empty of consolations which money couldn't buy. The consolations of having sometimes fed the hungry and covered the naked. I gave all my deer away, except a small part I kept for myself, and just sufficient to make a good supper for my mess, for meat was getting to be a rarity to us all. We had to live mostly on parched corn. The next day we marched on, and at night took up camp near a large cane break. While here, I told my mess I would again try for some meat, so I took my rifle and cut out, but hadn't gone far when I discovered a large gang of hogs. I shot one of them down in his tracks, and the rest broke directly towards the camp. In a few minutes the guns began to roar, as bad as if the whole army had been in an Indian battle, and the hog squealed as bad as the pig did when the devil turned barber. I shouldered my hog and went on to the camp. And when I got there, I found they had killed a good many of the hogs, and a fine fat cow into the bargain, that had broken out of the canebrake. We did very well that night, and the next morning marched on to a Cherokee town, where our officers stopped and gave the inhabitants an order on Uncle Sam for their cow and the hogs we had killed. The next day we met the main army, having had, as we thought, hard times, and plenty of them, though we had yet hardly seen the beginning of trouble. After our meeting we went on to Radcliffe's, where I had been before while out as a spy, and when we got there we found he had hid all his provisions. We also got into the secret that he was the very rascal who had sent the runner to the Indian camp, with the news that the Red Sticks were crossing at the 10 Islands, and that his object was to scare me and my men away and send us back with a false alarm. To make some atonement for this, we took the old scoundrel's 2 big sons with us, and made them serve in the war. We then marched to a place which we called Camp Wills, and here it was that Captain Cannon was promoted to a colonel, and Colonel Coffee to a general. We then marched to the 10 Islands, on the Coosa River, where we established a fort, and our spy companies were sent out. They soon made prisoners of Bob Catala and his warriors, and in a few days afterwards we heard of some Indians in a town about 8 miles off. So we mounted our horses and put out for that town, under the direction of 2 friendly Creeks we had taken for pilots. We also had a Cherokee colonel, Dick Brown, and some of his men with us. When we got near the town, we divided. One of our pilots went with each division, and so we passed on each side of the town, keeping near to it until our lines met on the far side. We then closed up at both ends so as to surround it completely, and then we sent Captain Hammond's company of Rangers to bring on the affray. He had advanced near the town when the Indians saw him, and they raised the yell and came running at him like so many red devils. The main army was now formed in a hollow square around the town, and they pursued Hammond till they came in reach of us. We then gave them a fire, and they returned it, and then ran back into their town. We began to close on the town by making our files closer and closer, and the Indians soon saw they were our property. So most of them wanted us to take them prisoners, and their women of the tribe and all would run and take hold of any of us they could, and give themselves up. I saw 7 women of the tribe hold one man, which made me think of the Scriptures. So I hollered out that the Scriptures were fulfilling, that there were 7 women holding one man's coat tail. But I believe it was a hunting shirt all the time. We took them all prisoners that came out to us in this way. But I saw some warriors run into a house until I counted 46 of them. We pursued them until we got near the house, when we saw a woman of the tribe sitting in the door, and she placed her feet against the bough she had in her hand, and then took an arrow, and raising her feet, she drew with all her might, and let fly at us, and she killed a man, whose name, I believe, was Moore. He was a lieutenant, and his death so enraged us all that she was fired on, and had at least 20 balls blown through her. This was the first man I ever saw killed with a bow and arrow. We now shot them like dogs, and then set the house on fire, and burned it up with the 46 warriors in it. I recollect seeing a boy who was shot down near the house. His arm and thigh was broken, and he was so near the burning house that the grease was stewing out of him. In this situation he was still trying to crawl along, but not a murmur escaped him, though he was only about 12 years old. So sullen is the Indian when his dander is up that he had sooner die than make a noise or ask for quarters. The number that we took prisoners, being added to the number we killed, amounted to 186, though I don't remember the exact number of either. We had 5 of our men killed. We then returned to our camp at which our fort was erected, and known by the name of Fort Strother. No provisions had yet reached us, and we had now been for several days on half rations. However, we went back to our Indian town on the next day, when many of the carcasses of the Indians were still to be seen. They looked very awful, for the burning had not entirely consumed them, but given them a very terrible appearance, at least what remained of them. It was, somehow or other, found out that the house had a potato cellar under it, and an immediate examination was made, for we were all as hungry as wolves. We found a fine chance of potatoes in it, and hunger compelled us to eat them, though I had a little rather not, if I could have helped it, for the oil of the Indians we had burned up on the day before had run down on them, and they looked like they had been stewed with fat meat. We then again returned to the army, and remained there for several days almost starving, as all our beef was gone. We commenced eating the beef hides, and continued to eat every scrap we could lay our hands on. At length an Indian came to our guard one night, and hollered and said he wanted to see Captain Jackson. He was conducted to the General's Market, into which he entered, and in a few minutes we received orders to prepare for marching. In an hour we were all ready, and took up the line of march. We crossed the Coosa River and went on in the direction to Fort Talladega. When we arrived near the place, we met 1,100 painted warriors, the very choice of the Creek Nation. They had encamped near the fort, and had informed the friendly Indians who were in it that if they didn't come out and fight with them against the whites, they would take their fort and all their ammunition and provisions. The friendly party asked 3 days to consider it, and agreed that if on the 3rd day they didn't come out ready to fight with them, they might take their fort. Thus they put them off. They then immediately started their runner to General Jackson, and he and the army pushed over, as I have just before stated. The camp of warriors had their spies out, and discovered us coming some time before we got to the fort. They then went to the friendly Indians, and told them Captain Jackson was coming, and had a great many fine horses and blankets and guns and everything else. And if they would come out and help to whip him, and to take his plunder, it should all be divided with those in the fort. They promised that when Jackson came, they would then come out and help to whip him. It was about an hour by sun in the morning when we got near the fort. We were piloted by friendly Indians, and divided as we had done on a former occasion, so as to go to the right and left of the fort, and consequently of the warriors who were camped near it. Our lines marched on, as before, till they met in front, and then closed in the rear, forming again into a hollow square. We then sent on old Major Russell, with his spy company, to bring on the battle. Captain Evans' company went also. When they got near the fort, the top of it was lined with the friendly Indians, crying out as loud as they could roar, "How-dy-do, brother, howdy-do!" They kept this up till Major Russell had passed by the fort and was moving on towards the warriors. They were all painted as red as scarlet, and were just as naked as they were born. They had concealed themselves under the bank of a branch that ran partly around the fort, in the manner of a half-moon. Russell was going right into their circle, for he couldn't see them, while the Indians on the top of the fort were trying every plan to show him his danger. But he couldn't understand them. At last, 2 of them jumped from it and ran, and took his horse by the bridle, and pointing to where they were, told him there were thousands of them lying under the bank. This brought them to a halt, and about this moment the Indians fired on them, and came rushing forth like a cloud of Egyptian locusts, and screaming like all the young devils had been turned loose, with the old devil of all at their head. Russell's company quit their horses, and took into the fort, and their horses ran up to our line, which was then in full view. The warriors then came yelling on, meeting us, and continued till they were within shot of us, when we fired and killed a considerable number of them. They then broke like a gang of steers, and ran across to our other line, where they were again fired on. And so we kept them running from one line to the other, constantly under a heavy fire, until we had killed upwards of 400 of them. They fought with guns, and also with their bows and arrows, but at length they made their escape through a part of our line, which was made up of drafted militia, which broke ranks, and they passed. We lost 15 of our men, as brave fellows as ever lived or died. We buried them all in one grave, and started back to our fort, but before we got there, 2 more of our men died of wounds they had received, making our total loss 17 good fellows in that battle. We now remained at the fort a few days, but no provision came yet, and we were all likely to perish. The weather also began to get very cold, our clothes were nearly worn out, and horses were getting very feeble and poor. Our officers proposed to General Jackson to let us return home and get fresh horses and fresh clothing, so as to be better prepared for another campaign. For our 60 days had long been out, and that was the time we entered for. But the general took the responsibility on himself and refused. We were, however, determined to go. With this the general issued his orders against it, but we began to fix for a start, as provisions were too scarce. The general went and placed his cannon on a bridge we had to cross, and ordered out his regulars and drafted men to keep us from crossing. But when the militia started to guard the bridge, they would holler back at us to bring their knapsacks along when we came, for they wanted to go as bad as we did. We got ready and moved on till we came near the bridge, where the general's men were all strung along on both sides, but we all had our flints ready picked and our guns ready primed, that if we were fired on we might fight our way through or all die together. When we came still nearer the bridge, we heard the guards cocking their guns, and we did the same. But after all, we marched boldly on, and not a gun was fired, nor a life lost. When we had passed, no further attempt was made to stop us, but the general said we were the damnedest volunteers he had ever seen in his life, that we would volunteer and go out and fight, and then at our pleasure would volunteer and go home again, in spite of the devil. But we went on, and near Huntsville we met a reinforcement who was going on to join the army. It consisted of a regiment of volunteers, and was under the command of someone whose name I can't remember. They were 60-day volunteers. We got home pretty safely, and in a short time we had procured fresh horses and a supply of clothing better suited for the season. And then we returned to Fort Deposit, where our officers held a sort of a national convention on the subject of a message they had received from General Jackson, demanding that on our return we should serve out 6 months. We had already served 3 months instead of 2, which was the time we had volunteered for. On the next morning, the officers reported to us the conclusions they had come to, and told us if any of us felt bound to go on and serve out the 6 months, we could do so, but that they intended to go back home. I knowed if I went back home I couldn't rest, for I felt it my duty to be out, and when out was, somehow or other, always delighted to be in the very thickest of danger. A few of us, therefore, were determined to push on and join the army. The number I do not recollect, but it was very small. When we got out there, I joined Major Russell's company of spies. Before we reached the place, General Jackson had started. We went on likewise and overtook him at a place where we established a fort called Fort Williams, and leaving men to guard it, we went ahead, intending to go to a place called the Horseshoe Bend of the Tallapoosa River. When we came near that place, we began to find plenty of Indian signs, and we struck up camp for the night. About 2 hours before, we heard our guard firing, and we were all lip in little or no time. We mended up our campfires and then fell back in the dark, expecting to see the Indians pouring in, and intending, when they should do so, to shoot them by the light of our own fires. But it happened that they did not rush in as we had expected, but commenced a fire on us as we were. We were encamped in a hollow square, and we not only returned fire, but continued to shoot as well as we could in the dark till day broke, when the Indians disappeared. The only guide we had in shooting was to notice the flash of their guns and then shoot as directly at the place as we could guess. In this scrape we had 4 men killed and several wounded, but whether we killed any of the Indians or not, we never could tell, for it is their custom always to carry off their dead if they can possibly do so. We buried ours and then made a large log heap over them and set it on fire, so that the place of their deposit might not be known to the savages who, we knew, would seek for them, that they might scalp them. We made some horse litter for our wounded and took up a retreat. We moved on till we came to a large creek which we had to cross, and about half of our men had crossed when the Indians commenced firing on our left wing, and they kept it up very warmly. We had left Major Russell and his brother at the camp we had moved from that morning to see what discovery they could make as to the movements of the Indians. And about this time, while a warm fire was kept up on our left, as I have just stated, the Major came up in our rear and was closely pursued by a large number of Indians, who immediately commenced a fire on our artillery men. They hid themselves behind a large log and could kill one of our men almost every shot, being in open ground and exposed. The worst of all was, 2 of our colonels just at this trying moment left their men and by a forced march crossed the creek out of the reach of the fire. Their names at this late day would do the world no good, and my object is history alone, and not the slightest interference with character. An opportunity was now afforded for Governor Carroll to distinguish himself, and on this occasion he did so, by greater bravery than I ever saw any other man display. In truth, I believe, as firmly as I do, that General Jackson is President, that if it hadn't been for Carroll, we should all have been gently licked that time, for we were in a devil of a fix, part of our men on one side of the creek and part on the other, and the Indians all the time pouring it on us, as hot as fresh mustard to a sore shin. I will not say exactly that the old general was whipped, but I will say that if we escaped it at all, it was like old Henry Snyder going to heaven mid a tam-tight squeeze. I think he would confess himself that he was nearer whipped this time than he was at any other, for I know that all the world couldn't make him acknowledge that he was pointedly whipped. I know I was mighty glad when it was over, and the savages quit us, for I had begun to think there was one behind every tree in the woods. We buried our dead, the number of whom I have also forgotten, and again made horse leaders to carry our wounded, and so we put out and returned to Fort Williams, from which place we had started. In the meantime my horse had got crippled and was unfit for service, and as another reinforcement had arrived, I thought they could get along without me for a short time. So I got a furlough and went home, for we had had hard times again on this hunt, and I began to feel as though I had done Indian fighting enough for one time. I remained at home until after the army had returned to the Horseshoe Bend and fought the battle there. But not being with them at that time, of course no history of that fight can be expected of me. Chapter 7. Soon after this, an army was to be raised to go to Pensacola, and I was determined to go again with them, for I wanted a small taste of British fighting, and I supposed they would be there. Here again the entreaties of my wife were thrown in the way of my going, but all in vain, for I always had a way of just going ahead, at whatever I had a mind to. One of my neighbors, hearing I had been determined to go, came to me and offered me $100 to go in his place as a substitute, as he had been drafted. I told him I was better raised than to hire myself out to be shot at, but that I would go, and he should go too, and in that way the government would have the services of us both. But we didn't call General Jackson the government in those days, though we used to go and fight under him in the war. I fixed up and joined old Major Russell again, but we couldn't start with the main army, but followed on in a little time after them. In a day or two we had 130 men in our company, and we went over and crossed the Muscle Shoals at the same place where I had crossed when first out, and when we burned the Black Warriors' town. We passed through the Choctaw and Chickasaw nations on to Fort Stevens, and from there to what is called the Cutoff, at the junction of the Tom Bigby with the Alabama River. This place is near the old Fort Mims, where the Indians committed the great butchery at the commencement of the war. We were here about 2 days behind the main army, who had left their horses at the Cutoff and taken it on foot, and they did this because there was no chance for forage between there and Pensacola. We did the same, leaving enough men to take care of our horses and cut out on foot for that place. It was about 80 miles off, but in good heart we shouldered our guns, blankets, and provisions and trudged merrily on. About 12 o'clock the second day we reached the encampment of the main army, which was situated on a hill overlooking the city of Pensacola. My commander, Major Russell, was a great favorite with General Jackson, and our arrival was hailed with great applause, though we were a little after the feast, for they had taken the town and fort before we got there. That evening we went down into the town and could see the British fleet lying in sight of the place. We got some liquor and took a horn or so and went back to the camp. We remained there that night, and in the morning we marched back towards the Cutoff. We pursued this direction till we reached old Fort Mims, where we remained for 2 or 3 days. It was here that Major Russell was promoted from his command, which was only that of a captain of spies, to the command of a major in the line. He had been known long before at home as old Major Russell, and so we all continued to call him in the army. A Major Childs from East Tennessee also commanded a battalion, and he and the one Russell was now appointed to command, composed a regiment which, by agreement with General Jackson, was to quit his army and go to the south to kill up the Indians on the Scambie River. General Jackson and the main army set out the next morning for New Orleans, and Colonel Blue took command of the regiment which I have previously described. We remained, however, a few days after the general's departure, and then started also on our route. As it gave rise to so much war and bloodshed, it may not be improper here to give a little description of Fort Mims and the manner in which the Indian War commenced. The fort was built right in the middle of a large old field, and in it the people had been forted so long and so quietly that they didn't apprehend any danger at all, and had, therefore, become quite careless. A small black individual boy, whose business it was to bring up the calves at milking time, had been out for that purpose, and on coming back he said he saw a great many Indians. At this the inhabitants took the alarm and closed their gates and placed out their guards, which they continued for a few days. But finding that no attack was made, they concluded the little black individual had lied, and again threw their gates open and set all their hands out to work their fields. The same boy was out again on the same errand, when, returning in great haste and alarm, he informed them that he had seen the Indians as thick as trees in the woods. He was not believed, but was tucked up to receive a flogging for the supposed lie, and was actually getting badly licked at the very moment when the Indians came in a troop, loaded with rails, with which they stopped all the portholes of the fort on one side except the bastion, and then they fell in to cutting down the picketing. Those inside the fort had only the bastion to shoot from, as all the other holes were spiked up, and they shot several of the Indians while engaged in cutting. But as fast as one would fall, another would seize up the axe and chop away until they succeeded in cutting down enough of the picketing to admit them to enter. They then began to rush through, and continued until they were all in. They immediately commenced scalping, without regard to age or sex, having forced the inhabitants up to one side of the wound in a slaughter pen. The scene was particularly described to me by a young man who was in the fort when it happened, and subsequently went on with us to Pensacola. He said that he saw his father and mother, his 4 sisters, and the same number of brothers, all butchered in the most shocking manner, and that he made his escape by running over the heads of the crowd, who were against the fort wall, to the top of the fort, and then jumping off and taking to the woods. He was closely pursued by several Indians until he came to a small buoy, across which there was a log. He knew the log was hollow on the underside, so he slipped under the log and hid himself. He said he heard the Indians walk over him several times back and forward. He remained, nevertheless, still till night, when he came out and finished his escape. The name of this young man has entirely escaped my recollection, though his tale greatly excited my feelings. But to return to my subject. The regiment marched from where General Jackson had left us to Fort Montgomery, which was distant from Fort Mims about 1.5 miles, and there we remained for some days. Here we supplied ourselves pretty well with beef, by killing wild cattle, which had formerly belonged to the people who perished in the fort, but had gone wild after their massacre. When we marched from Fort Montgomery, we went some distance back towards Pensacola. Then we turned to the left and passed through a poor, piney country till we reached the Scamby River, near which we encamped. We had about 1,000 men, and as a part of that number, 186 Chickasaw and Choctaw Indians with us. That evening a boat landed from Pensacola, bringing many articles that were both good and necessary, such as sugar and coffee and liquors of all kinds. The same evening the Indians we had along proposed to cross the river, and the officers, thinking it might be good for them to do so, consented, and Major Russell went with them, taking 16 white men, of which number I was one. We camped on the opposite bank that night, and early in the morning we set out. We had not gone far before we came to a place where the whole country was covered with water and looked like a sea. We didn't stop for this, though, but just put in like so many spaniels, and waded on, sometimes up to our armpits, until we reached the Pine Hills, which made our distance through the water about 1.5 miles. Here we struck up a fire to warm ourselves, for it was cold, and we were chilled through by being so long in the water. We again moved on, keeping our spies out, 2 to our left near the bank of the river, 2 straight before us, and 2 others on our right. We had gone in this way about 6 miles up the river, when our spies on the left came to us leaping the brush like so many old bucks, and informed us that they had discovered a camp of Creek Indians, and that we must kill them. Here we paused for a few minutes, and the prophets pow-wowed over their men a while, and then got out their paint, and painted them, all according to their custom when going into battle. They then brought their paint to old Major Russell, and said to him that as he was an officer, he must be painted too. He agreed, and they painted him just as they had done themselves. We let the Indians understand that we white men would first fire on the camp, and then fall back, so as to give the Indians a chance to rush in and scalp them. The Chickasaws marched on our left hand, and the Choctaws on our right, and we moved on till we got in hearing of the camp, where the Indians were employed in beating up what they called Cheney briar root. On this they mostly subsisted. On a nearer approach we found they were on an island, and that we could not get to them. While we were chatting about this matter, we heard some guns fired, and in a very short time after a keen whoop, which satisfied us that wherever it was, there was war on a small scale. With that we all broke, like quarter horses, for the firing, and when we got there we found it was our 2 front spies, who related to us the following story. As they were moving on, they had met with 2 Creeks, who were out hunting their horses. As they approached each other, there was a large cluster of green bay bushes exactly between them, so that they were within a few feet of meeting before either was discovered. Our spies walked up to them, and speaking in the Shawnee tongue, informed them that General Jackson was at Pensacola, and they were making their escape, and wanted to know where they could get something to eat. The Creeks told them that 9 miles up the Conacher, the river they were then on, there was a large camp of Creeks, and they had cattle and plenty to eat. And further, that their own camp was on an island about a mile off, and just below the mouth of the Conacher. They held their conversation, and struck up a fire, and smoked together, and shook hands, and parted. One of the Creeks had a gun, the other had none, and as soon as they had parted, our Choctaws turned round, and shot down the one that had the gun, and the other attempted to run off. They snapped several times at him, but the gun still missing fire, they took after him, and overtaking him, one of them struck him over the head with his gun, and followed up his blows till he killed him. The gun was broken in the combat, and they then fired off the gun of the Creek they had killed, and raised the war whoop. When we reached them, they had cut off the heads of both the Indians, and each of those Indians with us would walk up to one of the heads, and taking his war club, would strike on it. This was done by every one of them, and when they had got done, I took one of their clubs, and walked up as they had done, and struck it on the head also. At this they all gathered round me, and patting me on the shoulder, would call me, "Warrior, warrior." They scalped the heads, and then we moved on a short distance to where we found a trace leading in towards the river. We took this trace and pursued it till we came to where a Spaniard had been killed and scalped, together with a woman, who we supposed to be his wife, and also 4 children. I began to feel mighty ticklish along about this time, for I knowed if there was no danger then, there had been, and I felt exactly like there still was. We, however, went on till we struck the river, and then continued down it till we came opposite to the Indian camp, where we found they were still beating their roots. It was now late in the evening, and they were in a thick cane brake. We had some few friendly Creeks with us who said they could decoy them, so we all hid behind trees and logs while the attempt was made. The Indians would not agree that we should fire, but picked out some of their best gunners and placed them near the river. Our Creeks went down to the river's side and hailed the camp in the Creek language. We heard an answer, and an Indian man started down towards the river, but didn't come in sight. He went back and again commenced beating his roots, and sent a woman of the tribe. She came down and talked with our Creeks until dark came on. They told her they wanted her to bring them a canoe, to which she replied that their canoe was on our side, that 2 of their men had gone out to hunt their horses and hadn't yet returned. They were the same 2 we had killed. The canoe was found, and 40 of our picked Indian warriors were crossed over to take the camp. There was at last only 1 man in it, and he escaped, and they took 2 women of the tribe and 10 children, but killed none of them, of course. We had run nearly out of provisions, and Major Russell had determined to go up the Conacher to the camp we had heard of from the Indians we had killed. I was one that he selected to go down the river that night for provisions with the canoe to where we had left our regiment. I took with me a man by the name of John Guess and one of the friendly Creeks, and cut out. It was very dark, and the river was so full that it overflowed the banks and the adjacent low bottoms. This rendered it very difficult to keep the channel, and particularly as the river was very crooked. At about 10 o'clock at night we reached the camp, and were to return by morning to Major Russell, with provisions for his trip up the river. But on informing Colonel Blue of this arrangement, he vetoed it, and said if Major Russell didn't come back the next day, it would be bad times for him. I found we were not to go up the Conacher to the Indian camp, and a man from my company offered to go up in my place to inform Major Russell. I let him go, and they reached the Major, as I was told, about sunrise in the morning, who immediately returned with those who were with him to the regiment, and joined us where we crossed the river, as hereafter stated. The next morning we all fixed up, and marched down the Scambie to a place called Miller's Landing, where we swam our horses across, and sent 2 companies down on the side of the bay opposite to Pensacola, where the Indians had fled when the main army first marched to that place. One was the company of Captain William Russell, a son of the old Major, and the other was commanded by a Captain Trimble. They went on, and had a little skirmish with the Indians. They killed some and took all the remaining prisoners, though I don't remember the numbers. We again met those companies in a day or 2, and sent the prisoners they had taken on to Fort Montgomery, in charge of some of our Indians. I did hear that after they left us, the Indians killed and scalped all the prisoners, and I never heard the report contradicted. I cannot positively say it was true, but I think it is entirely probable, for it is very much like the Indian character. Chapter 8. When we made a move from the point where we met the companies, we set out for Chattahoochee, the place for which we had started when we left Fort Montgomery. At the start, we had taken only 20 days' rations of flour and 8 days' rations of beef, and it was now 34 days before we reached that place. We were, therefore, in extreme suffering for want of something to eat, and exhausted with our exposure and the fatigues of our journey. I remember well that I hadn't myself tasted bread but twice in 19 days. I had bought a pretty good supply of coffee from the boat that had reached us from Pensacola on the Scamby, and on that we chiefly subsisted. At length one night our spies came in and informed us they had found Holmes' village on the Chattahoochee River, and we made an immediate push for that place. We traveled all night, expecting to get something to eat when we got there. We arrived about sunrise, and near the place prepared for battle. We were all so furious that even the certainty of a pretty hard fight could not have restrained us. We made a furious charge on the town, but to our great mortification and surprise, there wasn't a human being in it. The Indians had all run off and left it. We burned the town, however, but, melancholy to tell, we found no provision whatsoever. We then turned about and went back to the camp we had left the night before, as nearly starved as any set of poor fellows ever were in the world. We stayed there only a little while when we divided our regiment, and Major Childs with his men went back the way we had come for a considerable distance, and then turned to Baton Rouge, where they joined General Jackson and the main army on their return from Orleans. Major Russell and his men struck for Fort Decatur on the Tallapoosa River. Some of our friendly Indians, who knew the country, went on ahead of us, as we had no trail except the one they made to follow. With them we sent some of our ablest horses and men to get us some provisions, to prevent us from absolutely starving to death. As the army marched, I hunted every day, and would kill every hawk, bird, and squirrel that I could find. Others did the same, and it was a rule with us that when we stopped at night, the hunters would throw all they killed in a pile, and then we would make a general division among all the men. One evening I came in, having killed nothing that day. I had a very sick man in my mess, and I wanted something for him to eat, even if I starved myself. So I went to the fire of Captain Cowan, who commanded my company after the promotion of Major Russell, and informed him that I was on the hunt for something for a sick man to eat. I knowed the captain was as bad off as the rest of us, but I found him broiling a turkey's gizzard. He said he had divided the turkey out among the sick, that Major Smiley had killed it, and that nothing else had been killed that day. I immediately went to Smiley's fire, where I found him broiling another gizzard. I told him that it was the first turkey I had ever seen that had 2 gizzards. But so it was, I got nothing for my sick man. And now, seeing that every fellow must shift for himself, I determined that in the morning I would come up missing. So I took my mess and cut out to go ahead of the army. We knew that nothing more could happen to us if we went than if we stayed, for it looked like it was to be starvation anyway. We therefore determined to go on the old saying, root hog or die. We passed 2 camps at which our men, who had gone on before us, had killed Indians. At one they had killed 9, and at the other 3. About daylight we came to a small river, which I thought was the Scamby, but we continued on for 3 days, killing little or nothing to eat, till at last we all began to get nearly ready to give up the ghost and lie down and die. For we had no prospect of provision, and we knew we couldn't go much further without it. We came to a large prairie that was about 6 miles across it, and in this I saw a trail which I knowed was made by bear, deer, and turkeys. We went on through it till we came to a large creek, and the low grounds were all set over with wild rye, looking as green as a wheat field. We here made a halt, unsaddled our horses, and turned them loose to graze. One of my companions, a Mr. Van Zandt, and myself, then went up to the low grounds to hunt. We had gone some distance, finding nothing, when at last I found a squirrel, which I shot, but he got into a hole in the tree. The game was small, but necessity is not very particular, so I thought I must have him, and I climbed that tree 30 feet high, without a limb, and pulled him out of his hole. I shouldn't relate such small matters, only to show what lengths a hungry man will go to get something to eat. I soon killed 2 other squirrels and fired at a large hawk. At this, a large gang of turkeys rose from the canebrake and flew across the creek to where my friend was, who had just before crossed it. He soon fired on a large gobbler, and I heard it fall. By this time my gun was loaded again, and I saw one sitting on my side of the creek, which had flown over when he fired, so I blazed away, and down I brought him. I gathered him up, and a fine turkey he was. I now began to think we had struck a breeze of luck, and almost forgot our past sufferings in the prospect of once more having something to eat. I raised the shout, and my comrade came to me, and we went on to our camp with the game we had killed. While we were gone, 2 of our messes were out, and each of them had found a bee tree. We turned to cooking some of our game, but we had neither salt nor bread. Just at this moment, on looking down the creek, we saw our men, who had gone on before us for provisions, coming to us. They came up and measured out to each man a cupful of flour. With this we thickened our soup when our turkey was cooked, and our friends took dinner with us, and then went on. We now took our tomahawks and went and cut our bee trees, out of which we got a fine chance of honey, though we had been starving so long that we feared to eat much at a time, till, like the Irish by hanging, we got used to it again. We rested that night without moving our camp, and the next morning myself and Vincent again turned out to hunt. We had not gone far before I wounded a fine buck very badly, and while pursuing him I was walking on a large tree that had fallen down, when from the top of it a large bear broke out and ran off. I had no dogs, and I was sorry enough for it. For all the hunting I ever did, I have always delighted most in bear hunting. Soon after this I killed a large buck, and we had just gotten him to camp when our poor starved army came up. They told us that to lessen their suffering as much as possible, Captain William Russell had had his horse led up to be shot for them to eat, just at the moment that they saw our men returning, who had carried on the flour. We were now about 14 miles from Fort Decatur, and we gave away all our meat and honey, and went on with the rest of the army. When we got there, they could give us only 1 ration of meat, but not a mouthful of bread. I immediately got a canoe, and taking my gun, crossed over the river, and went to the big warrior's town. I had a large hat, and I offered an Indian a silver dollar for my hat full of corn. He told me that his corn was all shwestia, which in English means it was all gone. But he showed me where an Indian lived, who, he said, had corn. I went to him and made the same offer. He could speak a little broken English, and said to me, "You got any powder? You got a bullet?" I told him I had. He then said, "Me swap my corn for powder and bullet." I took out about 10 bullets and showed him, and he proposed to give me a hatful of corn for them. I took him up mighty quick. I then offered to give him 10 charges of powder for another hatful of corn. To this he agreed very willingly. So I took off my hunting shirt and tied up my corn, and though it had cost me very little of my powder and lead, yet I wouldn't have taken 50 silver dollars for it. I returned to the camp, and the next morning we started for the Hickory Ground, which was 30 miles off. It was here that General Jackson met the Indians and made peace with the body of the nation. We got nothing to eat at this place, and we had yet to go 49 miles over a rough and wilderness country to Fort Williams. Parched corn, and but little even of that, was our daily subsistence. When we reached Fort Williams, we got 1 ration of pork and 1 of flour, which was our only hope until we could reach Fort Strother. The horses were now giving out, and I remember having seen 13 good horses left in one day, the saddles and bridles being thrown away. It was 39 miles to Fort Strother, and we had to pass directly by Fort Talladega, where we first had the big Indian battle with the 1,100 painted warriors. We went through the old battleground, and it looked like a great gourd patch. The skulls of the Indians who were killed still lay scattered all about, and many of their frames were still perfect as the bones had not separated. But about 5 miles before we got to this battleground, I struck a trail, which I followed until it led me to one of their towns. Here I swapped some more of my powder and bullets for a little corn. I pursued on by myself till some time after night, when I came up with the rest of the army. That night my company and myself did pretty well, as I divided out my corn among them. The next morning we met the East Tennessee troops, who were on their road to Mobile, and my youngest brother was with them. They had plenty of corn and provisions, and they gave me what I wanted for myself and my horse. I remained with them that night, though my company went across the Coosa River to the fort, where they also had the good fortune to find plenty of provisions. Next morning I took leave of my brother and all my old neighbors, for there were a good many of them with him, and crossed over to my men at the fort. Here I had enough to go on, and after remaining a few days, cut out for home. Nothing more, worthy of the reader's attention, transpired till I was safely landed at home once more with my wife and children. I found them all well and doing well, and though I was only a rough sort of a backwoodsman, they seemed mighty glad to see me, however little the quality folks might suppose it. For I do reckon we love as hard in the backwood country as any people in the whole creation. But I had been home only a few days when we received orders to start again and go on to the Black Warrior and Cahaba rivers to see if there were no Indians there. I knowed well enough there was none, and I wasn't willing to trust my craw any more where there was neither any fighting to do nor anything to go on. And so I agreed to give a young man who wanted to go the balance of my wages if he would serve out my time, which was about a month. He did so, and when they returned, sure enough, they hadn't seen an Indian any more than if they had been all the time chopping wood in my clearing. This closed my career as a warrior, and I am glad of it, for I like life now a heap better than I did then. And I am glad all over that I lived to see these times, which I should not have done if I had kept fooling along in war and got used up at it. Chapter 9. I continued at home now, working my farm for 2 years, as the war finally closed soon after I quit the service. The battle at New Orleans had already been fought, and treaties were made with the Indians which put a stop to their hostilities. But this time I met with the hardest trial, which ever falls to the lot of men. Death, that cruel leveler of all distinctions, to whom the prayers and tears of husbands and of even helpless infancy are addressed in vain, entered my humble cottage and tore from my children an affectionate good mother, and from me a tender and loving wife. It is a scene long gone by, and one which it would be supposed I had almost forgotten. Yet when I turn my memory back on it, it seems as though it was the work of yesterday. It was the doing of the Almighty, whose ways are always right, though we sometimes think they fall heavily on us. And as painful as is, even yet, the remembrance of her sufferings, and the loss sustained by my little children and myself, yet I have no wish to lift up the voice of complaint. I was left with 3 children. The 2 oldest were sons, the youngest a daughter, and at that time a mere infant. It appeared to me at that moment that my situation was the worst in the world. I couldn't bear the thought of scattering my children, and so I got my youngest brother, who was also married, and his family to live with me. They took as good care of my children as they well could, but yet it wasn't all like the care of a mother. And though their company was to me in every respect like that of a brother and sister, yet it fell far short of being like that of a wife. So I came to the conclusion it wouldn't do, but that I must have another wife. There lived in the neighborhood a widow lady whose husband had been killed in the war. She had 2 children, a son and daughter, and both quite small, like my own. I began to think that as we were both in the same situation, it might be that we could do something for each other. And I therefore began to hint a little around the matter, as we were once in a while together. She was a good, industrious woman, and owned a snug little farm and lived quite comfortable. I soon began to pay my respects to her in real good earnest, but I was as sly about it as a fox when he is going to rob a hen roost. I found that my company wasn't at all disagreeable to her, and I thought I could treat her children with so much friendship as to make her a good stepmother to mine, and in this I wasn't mistaken, as we soon bargained and got married and then went ahead. In a great deal of peace we raised our first crop of children, and they are all married and doing well. But we had a second crop together, and I shall notice them as I go along, as my wife and myself both had a hand in them, and they therefore belong to the history of my second marriage. The next fall after this marriage, 3 of my neighbors and myself were determined to explore a new country. Their names were Robinson, Fraser, and Rich. We set out for the Creek country, crossing the Tennessee River, and after having made a day's travel, we stopped at the house of one of my old acquaintances, who had settled there after the war. Resting here a day, Fraser turned out to hunt, being a great hunter, but he got badly bit by a very poisonous snake, and so we left him and went on. We passed through a large, rich valley called Jones's Valley, where several other families had settled, and continued our course till we came near to the place where Tuscaloosa now stands. Here we camped, as there were no inhabitants, and hobbled out our horses for the night. About 2 hours before, we heard the bells on our horses going back the way we had come, as they had started to leave us. As soon as it was daylight, I started in pursuit of them on foot, and carried my rifle, which was a very heavy one. I went ahead the whole day, wading creeks and swamps, and climbing mountains, but I couldn't overtake our horses, though I could hear them at every house they passed. I at last found I couldn't catch up with them, and so I gave up the hunt, and turned back to the last house I had passed, and stayed there till morning. From the best calculation we could make, I had walked over 50 miles that day, and the next morning I was so sore and fatigued that I felt like I couldn't walk any more. But I was anxious to get back to where I had left my company, and so I started and went on, but mighty slowly, till after the middle of the day. I now began to feel mighty sick, and had a dreadful headache. My rifle was so heavy, and I felt so weak, that I lay down by the side of the trail in a perfect wilderness too, to see if I wouldn't get better. In a short time some Indians came along. They had some ripe melons and wanted me to eat some, but I was so sick I couldn't. They then signed to me that I would die and be buried, a thing I was confoundedly afraid of myself. But I asked them how close it was to any house. By their signs, again, they made me understand it was 1.5 miles. I got up to go, but when I rose, I reeled about like a cow with the blind staggers, or a fellow who had taken too many horns. One of the Indians proposed to go with me and carry my gun. I gave him $50 and accepted his offer. We got to the house, by which time I was pretty far gone, but was kindly received, and got on to a bed. The woman did all she could for me with her warm tea, but I still continued bad enough, with a high fever, and generally out of my senses. The next day 2 of my neighbors were passing the road, and heard of my situation, and came to where I was. They were going nearly the route I had intended to go, to look at the country, and so they took me first on one of their horses, and then on the other, till they got me back to where I had left my company. I expected I would get better and be able to go on with them, but instead of this, I got worse and worse. And when we got there, I wasn't able to sit up at all. I thought now the jig was mighty nigh up with me, but I was determined to keep a stiff upper lip. They carried me to a house, and each of my comrades bought him a horse, and they all set out together, leaving me behind. I knew but little that was going on for about 2 weeks, but the family treated me with every possible kindness in their power, and I shall always feel thankful to them. The man's name was Jesse Jones. At the end of 2 weeks I began to mend without the help of a doctor, or of any doctor's means. In this time, however, as they told me, I was speechless for 5 days, and they had no thought that I would ever speak again, in Congress or anywhere else. And so the woman, who had a bottle of Batesman's drops, thought if they killed me, I would only die anyway, and so she would try it with me. She gave me the whole bottle, which threw me into a sweat that continued on all night, when at last I seemed to put on makeup, spoke, and asked her for a drink of water. This almost alarmed her, for she was looking every minute for me to die. She gave me the water, and from that time I began slowly to mend, and so kept on till I was able at last to walk about a little. When I got there, so I could travel a little, I got a wagon that was passing along to haul me to where he lived, which was about 20 miles from my house. I still mended as we went along, and when we got to his stopping place, I hired one of his horses and went on home. I was so pale and so much reduced that my face looked like it had been half soled with brown paper. When I got there, it was to the utter astonishment of my wife, for she supposed I was dead. My neighbors, who had started with me, had returned and took my horse home, which they had found with theirs. And they reported that they had seen men who had helped to bury me, and who saw me draw my last breath. I knew this was a whopper of a lie as soon as I heard it. My wife had hired a man and sent him out to see what had become of my money and other things. But I had missed the man as I went in, and he didn't return until some time after I got home, as he went all the way to where I lay sick, before he heard that I was still in the land of the living and a-kicking. The place on which I lived was sickly, and I was determined to leave it. I therefore set out the next fall to look at the country which had been purchased by the Chickasaw tribe of Indians. I went on to a place called Shoal Creek, about 80 miles from where I lived, and here again I got sick. I took the ague and fever, which I supposed was brought on me by camping out. I remained here for some time, as I was unable to go farther, and in that time I became so well pleased with the country there that I resolved to settle in it. It was just a little distance from the purchase, and no order had been established there, but I thought I could get along without order as well as anybody else. And so I moved and settled myself down on the head of Shoal Creek. Chapter 10. I determined to make another move, and so I took my eldest son with me, and a young man by the name of Abram Henry, and cut out for the Obion. I selected a spot when I got there where I was determined to settle, and the nearest house to it was 7 miles, the next nearest was 15, and so on to 20. It was a complete wilderness and full of Indians who were hunting. There were plenty of almost every kind of game, which suited me exactly, as I was always fond of hunting. The house which was nearest me, and which, as I have already stated, was 7 miles off and on the different side of the Obion River, belonged to a man by the name of Owens, and I started to go there. I had taken one horse along to pack our provision, and when I got to the water, I hobbled him out to graze until I got back, as there was no boat to cross the river in, and it was so high that it had overflowed all the bottoms and low country near it. We now took water like so many beavers, notwithstanding it was mighty cold, and waded on. The water would sometimes be up to our necks, and at others not so deep. But I went, of course, before, and carried a pole with which I would feel along before me, to see how deep it was, and to guard against falling into a slough, as there was many in our way. When I would come to one, I would take out my tomahawk, and cut a small tree across it, and then go ahead again. Frequently my little son would have to swim, even where myself and the young man could wade. But we worked on till at last we got to the channel of the river, which made it about half a mile we had waded from where we took water. I saw a large tree that had fallen into the river from the other side, but it didn't reach across. One stood on the same bank where we were, that I thought I could fall, so as to reach the other. And so at it we went with my tomahawk, cutting away till we got it down, and as good luck would have it, it fell right, and made us a way that we could pass. When we got over this, it was still a sea of water as far as our eyes could reach. We took into it again, and went ahead for about a mile, hardly ever seeing a single spot of land, and sometimes very deep. At last we came in sight of land, which was a very pleasing thing, and when we got out, we went but a little way before we came in sight of the house, which was more pleasing than ever, for we were wet all over and mighty cold. I felt mighty sorry when I would look at my little boy and see him shaking like he had the worst sort of an ague, for there was no time for fever then. As we got near the house, we saw Mr. Owens and several men that were with him just starting away. They saw us and stopped, but looked astonished until we got up to them, and I made myself known. The men who were with him were the owners of a boat which was the first that ever went that far up the Obion River, and some hands he had hired to carry it about 100 miles, still further up, by water, though it was only about 30 by land, as the river is very crooked. They all turned back to the house with me, where I found Mrs. Owens, a fine, friendly old woman, and her kindness to my little boy did me 10 times as good as anything she could have done for me if she had tried her best. The old gentleman set out his bottle for us, and I concluded that if a horn wasn't good, then there was no use for its invention. So I switched off about a half pint, and the young man was by no means bashful in such a case. He took a strong pull at it, too. I then gave my boy some, and in a little time we felt pretty well. We dried ourselves by the fire, and were asked to go on board the boat that evening. I agreed to do so, but left my son with the old lady, and myself and my young man went to the boat with Mr. Owens and the others. The boat was loaded with whiskey, flour, sugar, coffee, salt, castings, and other articles suitable for the country, and they were to receive $500 to land the load at McClaymore's Bluff, besides the profit they could make on their load. This was merely to show that boats could get up to that point. We stayed all night with them, and had a high night of it, as I took enough steam to drive out all the cold that was in me, and about 3 times as much more. In the morning we concluded to go on with the boat to where a great hurricane had crossed the river and blew all the timber down into it. When we got there, we found the river was falling fast, and concluded we couldn't get through the timber without more rise. So we dropped down opposite Mr. Owens again, where they were determined to wait for more water. The next day it rained uproariously, and the river rose pretty considerably, but not enough yet. And so I got the boatmen all to go out with me to where I was going to settle, and we slapped up a cabin in little or no time. I got from the boat 4 barrels of meal and 1 of salt and about 10 gallons of whiskey. To pay for these, I agreed to go with the boat up the river to their landing place. I also got a large middling bacon, killed a fine deer, and left them for my young man and my little boy, who were to stay at my cabin till I got back, which I expected would be in 6 or 7 days. We cut out and moved up to the hurricane, where we stopped for the night. In the morning I started about daylight, intending to kill a deer, as I had no thought they would get the boat through the timber that day. I had gone but a little way before I killed a fine buck, and started to go back to the boat. But on the way I came on the tracks of a large gang of elks, and so I took after them. I had followed them only a little distance when I saw them, and directly after I saw 2 large bucks. I shot one down, and the other wouldn't leave him, so I loaded my gun and shot him down too. I hung them up and went ahead again after my elks. I pursued on till after the middle of the day before I saw them again, but they took the hint before I got in shooting distance and ran off. I still pushed on till late in the evening, when I found I was about 4 miles from where I had left the boat, and as hungry as a wolf, for I hadn't eaten a bite that day. I started down the edge of the river on low grounds, giving out the pursuit of my elks, and hadn't gone hardly any distance at all before I saw 2 more bucks, very large fellows too. I took a blizzard at one of them, and up he tumbled. The other ran off a few jumps and stops, and stood there till I loaded again and fired at him. I knocked his trotters from under him, and then I hung them both up. I pushed on again, and about sunset I saw 3 other bucks. I fell down with one of them, and the other 2 ran off. I hung this one up also, having now killed 6 that day. I then pushed on till I got to the hurricane, and at the lower edge of it, about where I expected the boat was. Here I hollered as hard as I could roar, but could get no answer. I fired off my gun, and the men on the boat fired one too, but quite contrary to my expectation, they had got through the timber, and were about 2 miles above me. It was now dark, and I had to crawl through the fallen timber the best way I could, and if the reader doesn't know it was bad enough, I am sure I do. For the vines and briars had grown all through it, and so thick that a good fat coon couldn't much more than get along. I got through at last, and went on near to where I had killed my last deer, and once more fired off my gun, which was again answered from the boat, which was still a little above me. I moved on as fast as I could, but soon came to water, and not knowing how deep it was, I halted and hollered till they came to me with a skiff. I now got to the boat without further difficulty, but the briars had worked on me at such a rate that I felt like I wanted sewing up all over. I took a pretty stiff horn, which soon made me feel much better, but I was so tired that I could hardly work my jaws to eat. In the morning, myself and a young man started and brought in the first buck I had killed, and after breakfast we went and brought in the last one. The boat then started, but we again went and got the two I had killed just as I turned down the river in the evening. And we then pushed on and overtook the boat, leaving the other two hanging in the woods, as we had now as much as we wanted. We got up the river very well, but quite slowly, and we landed on the 11th day at the place the load was to be delivered at. They gave me their skiff, and myself and a young man by the name of Flavius Harris, who had been determined to go and live with me, cut out down the river for my cabin, which we reached safely enough. We turned in and cleared a field and planted our corn, but it was so late in the spring we had no time to make rails, and therefore we put no fence around our field. There was no stock, however, nor anything else to disturb our corn, except the wild varmints, and the old serpent himself, with a fence to help him, couldn't keep them out. I made corn enough to do me, and during that spring I killed 10 bears and a great abundance of deer. But in all this time we saw the face of no white person in that country, except Mr. Owens's family and a very few passengers who went out there looking at the country. Indians, though, were still plenty enough. Having laid by my crap, I went home, which was a distance of about 150 miles. And when I got there, I was met by an order to attend a call session of our legislature. I attended it and served out my time, and then returned and took my family and what little plunder I had and moved to where I had built my cabin and made my crap. I gathered my corn and then set out for my fall's hunt. This was in the last of October, 1822. I found very many bears, and indeed all sorts of game and wild varmints, except buffalo. There were none of them. I hunted on till Christmas, having supplied my family very well all along with wild meat, at which time my powder gave out, and I had none either to fire Christmas guns, which is very common in that country, or to hunt with. I had a brother-in-law who had now moved out and settled about 6 miles west of me, on the opposite side of Rutherford's Fork of the Obion River, and he had bought me a keg of powder, but I had never gotten it home. There had just been another of Noah's freshers, and the low grounds were flooded all over with water. I knew the stream was at least a mile wide, which I would have to cross, as the water was from hill to hill, and yet I was determined to go on over in some way or other, so as to get my powder. I told this to my wife, and she immediately opposed it with all her might. I still insisted, telling her we had no powder for Christmas, and, worse than all, we were out of meat. She said we had as well starved as for me to freeze to death or to get drowned, and one or the other was certain if I attempted to go. But I didn't believe the half of this, and so I took my woolen wrappers and a pair of moccasins and put them on and tied up some dry clothes and a pair of shoes and stockings and started. But I didn't before know how much anybody could suffer and not die. This and some of my other experiments in water taught me something about it, and I therefore relate them. The snow was about 4 inches deep when I started, and when I got to the water, which was only about a quarter of a mile off, it looked like an ocean. I put in and waded on till I came to the channel, where I crossed that on a high log. I then took water again, having my gun and all my hunting tools along, and waded till I came to a deep slough that was wider than the river itself. I had crossed it often on a log, but behold, when I got there, no log was to be seen. I knowed of an island in the slough, and a sapling stood on it close to the side of that log, which was now entirely under water. I knowed further that the water was about 8 or 10 feet deep under the log, and I judged it to be about 3 feet deep over it. After studying a little what I should do, I determined to cut a forked sapling which stood near me, so as to lodge it against the one that stood on the island, in which I succeeded very well. I then cut a pole and crawled along on my sapling till I got to the one it was lodged against, which was about 6 feet above the water. I then felt about with my pole till I found the log, which was just about as deep under the water as I had judged. I then crawled back and got my gun, which I had left at the stump of the sapling I had cut, and again made my way to the place of lodgment, and then climbed down the other sapling so as to get on the log. I then felt my way along with my feet in the water about waist deep, but it was a mighty ticklish business. However, I got over, and by this time I had very little feeling in my feet and legs, as I had been all the time in the water, except at what time I was crossing the high log over the river and climbing my lodged sapling. I went a short distance before I came to another slough, over which there was a log, but it was floating on the water. I thought I could walk it, and so I mounted it, but when I had got about the middle of the deep water, somehow else, it turned over, and I went up to my head. I waded out of this deep water, and went ahead till I came to the highland, where I stopped to pull off my wet clothes and put on the others, which I had held up with my gun above the water when I fell in. I got them on, but my flesh had no feeling in it, I was so cold. I tied up the wet ones and hung them up in a bush. I now thought I would run so as to warm myself a little, but I couldn't raise a trot for some time. Indeed, I couldn't step more than half the length of my foot. After a while I got better and went on 5 miles to the house of my brother-in-law, having not even smelt fire from the time I started. I got there late in the evening, and he was very astonished to see me at such a time. I stayed all night, and the next morning was most piercing cold, and so they persuaded me not to go home that day. I agreed, and turned out and killed him 2 deer, but the weather still got worse and colder instead of better. I stayed that night, and in the morning they still insisted I couldn't get home. I knowed the water would freeze over, but not hard enough to bear me, and so I agreed to stay that day. I went out hunting again and pursued a big he-bear all day, but didn't kill him. The next morning was bitter cold, but I knowed my family was without meat, and I was determined to get home to them or die a-trying. I took my keg of powder and all my hunting tools and cut them out. When I got to the water, it was a sheet of ice as far as I could see. I put on to it, but hadn't gotten far before it broke through with me. And so I took out my tomahawk and broke my way along before me for a considerable distance. At last I got to where the ice would bear me for a short distance, and I mounted on it and went ahead. But it soon broke in again, and I had to wade on till I came to my floating log. I found it so tight this time that I knew it couldn't give me another fall, as it was frozen in with the ice. I crossed over it without much difficulty, and worked along till I got to my lodged sapling and my log under the water. The swiftness of the current prevented the water from freezing over it, and so I had to wade, just as I did when I crossed it before. When I got to my sapling, I left my gun and climbed out with my powder keg first, and then went back and got my gun. By this time I was nearly frozen to death, but I saw all along before me where the ice had been freshly broken, and I thought it must be a bear straggling about in the water. I, therefore, freshly primed my gun, and, cold as I was determined to make war on him if we met. But I followed the trail till it led me home, and I then found it had been made by my young man that lived with me, who had been sent by my distressed wife to see, if he could, what had become of me, for they all believed that I was dead. When I got home I wasn't quite dead, but mighty nighted, but I had my powder, and that was what I went for. Chapter 11. That night there fell a heavy rain, and it turned to a sleet. In the morning all hands turned out hunting. My young man and a brother-in-law, who had lately settled close by me, went down the river to hunt for turkeys, but I was for larger game. I told them I had dreamed the night before of having a hard fight with a big black African-American, and I knowed it was a sign that I was to have a battle with a bear, for in a bear country I never knowed such a dream to fail. So I started to go up above the hurricane, determined to have a bear. I had 2 pretty good dogs and an old hound, all of which I took along. I had gone about 6 miles up the river, and it was then about 4 miles across to the main Obion, so I determined to strike across to that, as I had found nothing yet to kill. I got on to the river and turned down it, but the sleet was still getting worse and worse. The bushes were all bent down and locked together with ice, so that it was almost impossible to get along. In a little time my dog started a large gang of old turkey gobblers, and I killed 2 of them of the biggest sort. I shouldered them up and moved on until I got through the hurricane. When I was so tired I laid my gobblers down to rest, as they were confused and heavy, and I was mighty tired. While I was resting, my old hound went to a log and smelt it a while, and then raised his eyes toward the sky, and cried out. Away he went, and my other dogs with him, and I shouldered up my turkeys again, and followed on as hard as I could drive. They were soon out of sight, and in a very little time I heard them begin to bark. When I got to them, they were barking up a tree, but there was no game there. I concluded it had been a turkey, and that it had flown away. When they saw me coming, they went away again, and after a little time began to bark as before. When I got near them, I found they were barking up the wrong tree again, as there was no game there. They served me in this way 3 or 4 times, until I was so insanely mad that I determined, if I could get near enough, to shoot the old hound at least. With this intention I pushed on harder, till I came to the edge of an open parara, and looking on before my dogs, I saw in and about the biggest bear that ever was seen in America. He looked, at the distance he was from me, like a large black bull. My dogs were afraid to attack him, and that was the reason they had stopped so often, that I might overtake them. They were now almost up with him, and I took my gobblers from my back and hung them up in a sapling, and broke like a quarter horse after my bear, for the sight of him had put new springs in me. I soon got near to them, but they were just getting into a roaring thicket, and so I couldn't run through it, but had to pick my way along, and had close work even at that. In a little time I saw the bear climbing up a large black oak tree, and I crawled on till I got within about 80 yards of him. He was sitting with his breast to me, and so I put fresh priming in my gun and fired at him. At this he raised one of his paws and snorted loudly. I loaded again as quickly as I could and fired as near the same place in his breast as possible. At the crack of my gun he came tumbling down, and the moment he touched the ground I heard one of my best dogs cry out. I took my tomahawk in one hand and my big butcher knife in the other, and ran up within 4 or 5 paces of him, at which he let my dog go and fixed his eyes on me. I got back in all sorts of a hurry, for I knowed if he got hold of me he would hug me altogether too close for comfort. I went to my gun and hastily loaded her again, and shot him the 3rd time, which killed him. I now began to think about getting him home, but I didn't know how far it was. So I left him and started, and in order to find him again I would blaze a sapling every little distance, which would show me the way back. I continued this till I got within about a mile of home, for there I knew very well where I was, and that I could easily find the way back to my blazes. When I got home, I took my brother-in-law and my young man and 4 horses and went back. We got there just before dark and struck up a fire and commenced butchering my bear. It was some time in the night before we finished it, and I can assert, in my honor, that I believed he would have weighed 600 pounds. It was the 2nd largest I ever saw. I killed one, a few years later, that weighed 617 pounds. I now felt fully compensated for my sufferings in going after my powder, and well satisfied that a dog might sometimes be doing a good business even when he seemed to be barking up the wrong tree. We got our meat home, and I had the pleasure to know that we now had plenty, and that of the best, and I continued through the winter to supply my family abundantly with bear meat and venison from the woods. Chapter 12. In the fall of 1825, I concluded I would build 2 large boats and load them with pipe staves for the market. So I went down to the lake, which was about 25 miles from where I lived, and hired some hands to assist me, and went to work, some at boat building and others to get staves. I worked on with my hands till the bears got fat, and then I turned to hunting to lay in a supply of meat. I soon killed and salted down as many as were necessary for my family. But about this time, one of my old neighbors, who had settled down on the lake about 25 miles from me, came to my house and told me he wanted me to go down and kill some bears in his area. He said they were extremely fat, and very fat. I know that when they were fat, they were easily taken, for a fat bear can't run fast or long. But I asked a bear no favors, no way, further than civility, for I now had 8 large dogs, and as fierce as painters, so that a bear stood no chance at all to get away from them. So I went home with him, and then went on down towards the Mississippi and commenced hunting. We were out for 2 weeks, and in that time killed 15 bears. Having now supplied my friend with plenty of meat, I engaged occasionally again with my hands in our boat building and getting staves. But I couldn't stand it any longer without another hunt. So I concluded to take my little son and cross over the lake and take a hunt there. We got over, and that evening turned out and killed 3 bears in little or no time. The next morning we drove up 4 forks and made a sort of scaffold on which we salted up our meat so as to have it out of the reach of the wolves, for as soon as we would leave our camp, they would take possession. We had just eaten our breakfast when a company of hunters came to our camp who had 14 dogs, but all so poor that when they would bark, they would almost have to lean up against a tree and take a rest. I told them their dogs couldn't run and smell of a bear, and they had better stay at my camp and feed them on the bones I had cut out of my meat. I left them there and cut them out. But I hadn't gotten very far when my dogs took a first-rate start after a very large, fat old he-bear, which ran right plump towards my camp. I pursued on, but my other hunters had heard my dogs coming and met them and killed the bear before I got up with him. I gave him to them and cut out again for a creek called Big Clover, which was not very far off. Just as I got there and was entering a cane brake, my dogs all broke and went ahead, and in a little time they raised a fuss in the cane and seemed to be going every way. I listened for a while and found my dogs were in 2 companies and that both were in a snorting fight. I sent my little son to one, and I broke for t'other. I got to mine first and found my dogs had a 2-year-old bear down, a-wooling away on him, so I just took out my big butcher and went up and slapped it into him and killed him without shooting. There were 5 of the dogs in my company. In a short time I heard my little son fire at his bear. When I went to him, he had killed it too. He had 2 dogs in his team. Just at this moment we heard my other dog barking a short distance off, and all the rest immediately broke to him. We pushed on too, and when we got there we found he had still a larger bear than either of them we had killed, treed by himself. We killed that one also, which made 3 we had killed in less than half an hour. We turned in and butchered them, and then started to hunt for water and a good place to camp. But we had no sooner started than our dogs took a start after another one, and away they went like a thunder gust, and were out of hearing in a minute. We followed the way they had gone for some time, but at length we gave up the hope of finding them and turned back. As we were going back, I came to where a poor fellow was grubbing, and he looked like the very picture of hard times. I asked him what he was doing away there in the woods by himself. He said he was grumbling for a man who intended to settle there, and the reason why he did it was that he had no meat for his family, and he was working for a little. I was mighty sorry for the poor fellow, for it was not only a hard, but a very slow way to get meat for a hungry family. So I told him if he would go with me, I would give him more meat than he could get, by grubbing in a month. I intended to supply him with meat, and also to get him to assist my little boy in packing in and salting up my bears. He had never seen a bear killed in his life. I told him I had killed 6 then, and my dogs were hard after another. He went off to his little cabin, which was a short distance in the brush, and his wife was very anxious he should go with me. So we started and went to where I had left my 3 bears and made a camp. We then gathered my meat and salted and scaffolded for it, as I had done the other. Night now came on, but no word from my dogs yet. I afterwards found they had treed the bear about 5 miles off, near to a man's house, and had barked at it the whole enduring night. Poor fellows! Many times they looked for me and wondered why I didn't come, for they knowed there was no mistake in me, and I knew they were as good as ever. In the morning, as soon as it was light enough to see, the man took his gun and went to them, and shot the bear, and killed it. My dogs, however, wouldn't have anything to say to this stranger, so they left him and came early in the morning back to me. We got our breakfast and cut out again, and we killed 4 large and very fat bears that day. We hunted out the week, and in that time we killed 17, all of them first rate. When we closed our hunt, I gave the man over 1,000 pounds of fine fat bear meat, which pleased him mightily, and made him feel as rich as a king. I saw him the next fall, and he told me he had plenty of meat to do him the whole year from his week's hunt. My son and I have now gone home. This was the week between Christmases and New Year that we made this hunt. When I got home, one of my neighbors was out of meat and wanted me to go back and let him go with me to take another hunt. I couldn't refuse, but I told him I was afraid the bear had taken to house by that time, for after they get very fat in the fall and early part of the winter, they go into their holes in large hollow trees, or into hollow logs, or their cane houses, or the hurricanes, and lie there till spring like frozen snakes. And one thing about this will seem mighty strange to many people. From about the 1st of January to about the last of April, these varmints lie in their holes all together. In all that time they have no food to eat, and yet when they come out, they are not an ounce lighter than when they went to the house. I don't know the cause of this, and still I know it is a fact, and I leave it for others who have more learning than myself to account for it. They have not a particle of food with them, but they just lie and suck the bottom of their paws all the time. I have killed many of them in their trees, which enables me to speak positively on this subject. However, my neighbor, whose name was McDaniel, and my little son and I went down to the lake to my second camp, where I had killed my 17 bears the week before, and turned to hunting. But we hunted hard all day without getting a single start. We had carried but little provisions with us, and the next morning was entirely out of meat. I sent my son about 3 miles off to the house of an old friend to get some. The old gentleman was very pleased to hear I was hunting in those parts, for the year before the bears had killed a great many of his hogs. He was that day killing his bacon hogs, and so he gave my son some meat, and sent word to me that I must come into his house that evening, that he would have plenty of feed for my dogs, and some accommodations for ourselves. But before my son got back, we had gone out hunting, and in a large canebrake my dogs found a big bear in a cane house, which he had fixed for his winter quarters, as they sometimes do. When my lead dog found him and raised the yell, all the rest broke to him, but none of them entered his house until we got up. I encouraged my dogs, and they know me so well that I could have made them seize the old serpent himself, with all his horns and heads, and cloven foot and ugliness into the bargain, if he would only have come to light, so that they could have seen him. They bulged in, and in an instant the bear followed them out, and I told my friend to shoot him, as he was mighty wrathy to kill a bear. He did so, and killed his prime. We carried him to our camp, by which time my son had returned, and after we got our dinners, we packed up, and cut for the house of my old friend, whose name was Davidson. We got there, and stayed with him all that night, and the next morning, having salted up our meat, we left it with him, and started to take a hunt between the Obion Lake and the Redfoot Lake, as there had been a dreadful hurricane which passed between them, and I was sure there must be a heap of bears in the fallen timber. We had gone about 5 miles without seeing any sign at all, but at length we got on some high caney ridges, and as we rode along, I saw a hole in a large black oak, and on examining more closely, I discovered that a bear had climbed the tree. I could see his tracks going up, but none coming down, and so I was sure he was in there. A person who is acquainted with bear hunting can tell easy enough when the varmint is in the hollow, for as they go up they don't slip a bit, but as they come down they make long scratches with their nails. My friend was a little ahead of me, but I called him back and told him there was a bear in that tree, and I must take him out. So we lit from our horses, and I found a small tree which I thought I could fall so as to lodge against my bear tree, and we fell to work chopping it with our tomahawks. I intended, when we lodged the tree against the other, to let my little son go up and look into the hole, for he could climb like a squirrel. We had chopped on a little time and stopped to rest, when I heard my dogs barking mighty severe at some distance from us, and I told my friend I knowed they had a bear, for it is the nature of a dog, when he finds you are hunting bears, to hunt for nothing else. He becomes fond of the meat, and considers other game as not worth a notice, as old Johnson said of the devil. We concluded to leave our tree a bit, and went to my dogs, and when we got there, sure enough, they had an eternal great big fat bear up a tree, just ready for shooting. My friend again petitioned me for liberty to shoot this one also. I had a little rather not, as the bear was so big, but I couldn't refuse, and so he blazed away, and down came the old fellow like some great log had fallen. I now missed one of my dogs, the same that I before spoke of as having treed the bear by himself some time before, when I started the three in the canebrake. I told my friend that my missing dog had a bear somewhere, just as sure as fate, so I left them to butcher the one we had just killed, and I went up on a piece of high ground to listen for my dog. I heard him barking with all his might some distance off, and I pushed ahead for him. My other dogs heard him break to him, and when I got there, sure enough again, he had another bear-ready tree. If he hadn't, I wish I may be shot. I fired on him and brought him down, and then went back, and helped finish butchering the one at which I had left my friend. We then packed both to our tree, where we had left my boy. By this time the little fellow had cut the tree down that we intended to lodge, but it fell the wrong way. He had then feathered in on the big tree to cut that, and had found that it was nothing but a shell on the outside and all .5 in the middle, as too many of our big men are in these days, having only an outside appearance. My friend and my son cut away on it, and I went off about 100 yards with my dogs to keep them from running under the tree when it should fall. On looking back at the hole, I saw the bear's head out of it, looking down at them as they were cutting. I hollered to them to look up, and they did so, and McDaniel catched up his gun, but by this time the bear was out and coming down the tree. He fired at it, and as soon as it touched ground, the dogs were all around it, and they had a roll and tumble fight to the foot of the hill, where they stopped him. I ran up and put my gun against the bear, fired, and killed him. We now had 3, and so we made our scaffold and salted them up. Chapter 13. In the morning I left my son at the camp, and we started on towards the hurricane, and when we had gone about a mile, we started a very large bear, but we got along mighty slowly on account of the cracks in the earth caused by the earthquakes. We, however, made out to keep in hearing of the dogs for about 3 miles, and then we came to the hurricane. Here we had to quit our horses, as old Nick himself couldn't have got through it without sneaking it along in the form that he put on, to make a fool of our old grandmother Eve. By this time several of my dogs had gotten tired and came back, but we went ahead on foot for some little time in the hurricane, when we met a bear coming straight to us and not more than 20 or 30 yards off. I started my tired dogs after him, and McDaniel pursued them, and I went on to where my other dogs were. I had seen the track of the bear they were after, and I knowed he was a screamer. I followed on to about the middle of the hurricane, but my dogs pursued him so close that they made him climb an old stump about 20 feet high. I got within shooting distance of him and fired, but I was all over in such a flutter from fatigue and running that I couldn't hold steady. But, however, I broke his shoulder, and he fell. I ran up and loaded my gun as quickly as possible, and shot him again, and killed him. When I went to take out my knife to butcher him, I found I had lost it in the hurricane. The vines and briars were so thick that I would sometimes have to get down and crawl like a varmint to get through it all, and a vine had, as I supposed, caught in the handle and pulled it out. While I was standing and studying what to do, my friend came to me. He had followed my trail through the hurricane and had found my knife, which was mighty good news to me, as a hunter hates the worst in the world to lose a good dog or any part of his hunting tools. I now left McDaniel to butcher the bear, and I went after our horses and brought them as near as the nature of the case would allow. I then took our bags and went back to where he was, and when we had skinned the bear, we fleeced off the fat and carried it to our horses at several loads. We then packed it up on our horses and had a heavy pack of it on each one. We now started and went on till about sunset, when I concluded we must be near our camp, so I hollered, and my son answered me, and we moved on in the direction to the camp. We had gone but a little way when I heard my dogs make a warm start again, and I jumped down from my horse and gave him up to my friend, and told him I would follow them. He went on to the camp, and I went ahead after my dogs with all my might for a considerable distance, till last night came on. The woods were very rough and hilly, and all covered over with cane. I now was compelled to move on more slowly, and was frequently falling over logs and into the cracks made by the earthquakes, so that I was very much afraid I would break my gun. However, I went on about 3 miles when I came to a good big creek, which I waded. It was very cold, and the creek was about knee-deep, but I felt no great inconvenience from it just then, as I was all over wet with sweat from running, and I felt hot enough. After I got over the creek and out of the cane, which was very thick on all our creeks, I listened for my dogs. I found they had either treed or brought the bear to a stop as they continued barking in the same place. I pushed on as near in the direction to the noise as I could, till I found the hill was too steep for me to climb, and so I backed and went down the creek some distance till I came to a hollow, and then took up that, till I come to a place where I could climb up the hill. It was mighty dark, and it was difficult to see my way or anything else. When I got up the hill, I found I had passed the dogs, and so I turned and went to them. I found, when I got there, they had tread the bear in a large forked poplar, and it was sitting in the fork. I could see the lump, but not plain enough to shoot with any certainty, as there was no moonlight, and so I set in to hunting for some dry brush to make me a light, but I could find none, though I could find that the ground was torn mightily to pieces by the cracks. At last I thought I could shoot by guess and kill him, so I pointed as near the lump as I could and fired away. But the bear didn't come. He only climbed up higher and got out on a limb, which helped me to see him better. I now loaded up again and fired, but this time he didn't move at all. I commenced loading for a third fire, but the first thing I knowed, the bear was down among my dogs, and they were fighting all around me. I had my big butcher in my belt, and I had a pair of dressed buckskin breeches on. So I took out my knife and stood, determined, if he should get hold of me, to defend myself in the best way I could. I stood there for some time, and could now and then see a white dog I had, but the rest of them, and the bear, which were dark-colored, I couldn't see at all. It was so miserable dark. They still fought around me, and sometimes within 3 feet of me, but at last the bear got down into one of the cracks that the earthquakes had made in the ground, about 4 feet deep, and I could tell the biting end of him by the hollering of my dogs. So I took my gun and pushed the muzzle of it about, till I thought I had it against the main part of his body, and fired, but it happened to be only the fleshy part of his foreleg. With this he jumped out of the crack, and he and the dogs had another hard fight around me as before. At last, however, they forced him back into the crack again, as he was when I had shot. I had laid down my gun in the dark, and I now began to hunt for it, and while hunting I got hold of a pole, and I concluded I would punch him a while with that. I did so, and when I would punch him, the dogs would jump in on him, when he would bite them badly, and they would jump out again. I concluded, as he would take punches so patiently, it might be that he would lie still enough for me to get down in the crack and feel slowly along till I could find the right place to give him a dig with my butcher. So I got down, and my dogs got in before him and kept his head towards them, till I got along easily up to him, and placing my hand on his rump, felt for his shoulder, just behind which I intended to stick him. I made a lounge with my long knife, and fortunately stuck him right through the heart, at which he just sank down, and I crawled out in a hurry. In a little time my dogs all came out too, and seemed satisfied, which was the way they always had of telling me that they had finished him. I suffered very much that night with cold, as my leather breeches and everything else I had on was wet and frozen. But I managed to get my bear out of this crack after several hard trials, and so I butchered him and laid down to try to sleep. But my fire was very bad, and I couldn't find anything that would burn well to make it any better, and I concluded I should freeze if I didn't warm myself in some way by exercise. So I got up and hollered a while, and then I would just jump up and down with all my might, and throw myself into all sorts of motions. But all this wouldn't do, for my blood was now getting cold, and the chills coming all over me. I was so tired, too, that I could hardly walk, but I thought I would do the best I could to save my life, and then, if I died, nobody would be to blame. So I went to a tree about 2 feet through, and not a limb on it for 30 feet, and I would climb up it to the limbs, and then lock my arms together around it and slide down to the bottom again. This would make the insides of my legs and arms feel mighty warm and good. I continued this till daylight in the morning, and how often I climbed up my tree and slid down I don't know, but I reckon at least 100 times. In the morning I got my bear hung up so as to be safe, and then set out to hunt for my camp. I found it after a while, and McDaniel and my son were very much rejoiced to see me get back, for they were about to give me up for lost. We got our breakfasts, and then secured our meat by building a high scaffold and covering it over. We had no fear of its spoiling, for the weather was so cold that it couldn't. We now started after my other bear, which had caused me so much trouble and suffering, and before we got him, we got a start after another, and took him also. We went on to the creek I had crossed the night before, and camped, and then went to where my bear was, that I had killed in the crack. When we examined the place, McDaniel said he wouldn't have gone into it, as I did, for all the bears in the woods. We took the meat down to our camp and salted it, and also the last one we had killed, intending in the morning to make a hunt in the hurricane again. We prepared for resting that night, and I can assure the reader I was in need of it. We had laid down by our fire, and about 10 o'clock there came a terrible earthquake, which shook the earth so that we were rocked about like we had been in a cradle. We were very much alarmed, for though we were accustomed to feel earthquakes, we were now right in the region which had been torn to pieces by them in 1812, and we thought it might take a notion and swallow us up, like the big fish did Jonah. In the morning we packed up and moved to the hurricane, where we made another camp, and turned out that evening and killed a very large bear, which made 8 we had now killed in this hunt. The next morning we entered the hurricane again, and in little or no time my dogs were in full cry. We pursued them, and soon came to a thick cane brake, in which they had stopped their bear. We got up close to him, as the cane was so thick that we couldn't see more than a few feet. Here I made my friend hold the cane a little open with his gun till I shot the bear, which was a mighty large one. I killed him dead in his tracks. We got him out and butchered him, and in a little time started another and killed him, which now made 10 we had killed. And we knowed we couldn't pack any more home, as we had only 5 horses along. Therefore we returned to the camp and salted up all our meat, to be ready for a start homeward next morning. The morning came, and we packed our horses with the meat, and had as much as they could possibly carry, and sure enough, cut out for home. It was about 30 miles, and we reached home the second day. I had now accommodated my neighbor with enough meat to do so, and had killed in all, up to that time, 58 bears during the fall and winter. As soon as the time came for them to quit their houses and come out again in the spring, I took a notion to hunt a little more, and in about 1 month I killed 47 more, which made 105 bears I had killed in less than 1 year from that time. Chapter 14. Having now closed my hunting for that winter, I returned to my hands, who were engaged about my boats and staves, and made ready for a trip down the river. I had 2 boats and about 30,000 staves, and so I loaded them and set out for New Orleans. I got out of the Obion River, in which I had loaded my boats, very well. But when I got into the Mississippi, I found all my hands were bad scared, and in fact I believe I was scared a little, the worst of any. For I had never been down the river, and I soon discovered that my pilot was as ignorant of the business as myself. I hadn't gone far before I determined to lash the two boats together. We did so, but it made them so heavy and obstinate that it was next akin to impossible to do anything at all with them, or to guide them right in the river. That evening we fell in company with some Ohio boats, and about night we tried to land, but we could not. The Ohio men hollered to us to go on and run all night. We took their advice, though we had a good deal rather than not, but we couldn't do any other way. In a short distance we got into what is called the Devil's Elbow, and if any place in the wide creation has its own proper name, I thought it was this. Here we had about the hardest work that I ever was engaged in my life, to keep out of danger, and even then we were in it all the while. We twice attempted to land at wood yards, which we could see, but couldn't reach. The people would run out with lights and try to instruct us how to get to shore, but all in vain. Our boats were so heavy that we couldn't take them much any way, except the way they wanted to go, and just the way the current would carry them. At last we quit trying to land, and concluded just to go ahead as well as we could, for we found we couldn't do any better. Sometime in the night I was down in the cabin of one of the boats, sitting by the fire, thinking on what a hobble we had got into, and how much better bear hunting was on hard land than floating along on the water when a fellow had to go ahead, whether he was exactly willing or not. The hatchway into the cabin came slap down, right through the top of the boat, and it was the only way out, except a small hole in the side, which we had used for putting our arms through to dip up water before we lashed the boats together. We were now floating sideways, and the boat I was in was the hindmost as we went. All at once I heard the hands begin to run over the top of the boat in great confusion and pull with all their might, and the first thing I knowed after this, we went broadside full tilt against the head of an island where a large raft of drift timber had lodged. The nature of such a place would be, as everybody knows, to suck the boats down and turn them right under this raft, and the uppermost boat would, of course, be sucked down and go under first. As soon as we struck, I bulged for my hatchway as the boat was turning under, sure enough. But when I got to it, the water was pouring through in a current as large as the hole would let it, and as strong as the weight of the river could force it. I found I couldn't get out of here, for the boat was now turned down in such a way that it was steeper than a housetop. I now thought of the hole in the side, and made my way in a hurry for that. With difficulty I got to it, and when I got there, I found it was too small for me to get out by my own dower, and I began to think that I was in a worse box than ever. But I put my arms through and hollered as loud as I could roar, as the boat I was in hadn't yet quite filled with water up to my head, and the hands who were next to the raft, seeing my arms out and hearing me holler, seized them and began to pull. I told them I was sinking, and to pull my arms off or force me through, for now I knowed well enough it was neck or nothing, come out or sink. By a violent effort they jerked me through, but I was in a pretty pickle when I got through. I had been sitting without any clothing over my shirt. This was torn off, and I was literally skinned like a rabbit. I was, however, well pleased to get out in any way, even without a shirt or hide. As before I could straighten myself on the boat next to the raft, the one they pulled me out of went entirely under, and I have never seen it any more to this day. We all escaped onto the raft, where we were compelled to sit all night about a mile from land on either side. 4 of my company were bareheaded and 3 barefooted, and of that number I was one. I reckon I looked like a pretty cracklin' ever to get to Congress. We had now lost all our loading and every particle of our clothing except what little we had on. But over all this, while I was setting there, in the night, floating about on the drift, I felt happier and better off than I ever had in my life before, for I had just made such a marvelous escape that I had forgot almost everything else in that. And so I felt prime. In the morning about sunrise we saw a boat coming down, and we hailed her. They sent a large skiff and took us all on board and carried us down as far as Memphis. Here I met with a friend that I will never forget as long as I am able to go ahead with anything. It was Major Winchester, a merchant of that place. He let us all have hats and shoes and some little money to go upon, and so we all parted. A young man and myself concluded to go on down to Natchez to see if we could hear anything of our boats, for we supposed they would float out from the raft and keep on down the river. We got on a boat at Memphis that was going down, and so cut out. Our largest boat, we were informed, had been seen about 50 miles below where we stove, and an attempt had been made to land her, but without success, as she was as hard-headed as ever. This was the last of my boats, and of my boating, for it went so badly with me, along at the first, that I hadn't much mind to try it any more. I now returned home again, and as the next August was the congressional election, I began to turn my attention a little to that matter, as it was beginning to be talked of a good deal among the people.